Please continue to enjoy your lunch. Thank you for bearing with us on that. But we are thrilled and again privileged to have everybody here with us for the final commission meeting. President Nelson will be here shortly. He's at another luncheon engagements. College presidents have to be at 3 different places at the same time. So, but he will be with us for this afternoon, and he'll bring greetings from the college formally at tonight's dinner. We are thrilled to have you all here back on campus. If you're here for the first time, welcome to the Center for the Environment. We've got a 190-acre ecological preserve behind us. And if we had more time, we'd schedule in a little walkthrough, considering the weather here today. Of course, it is North Carolina, so wait 24 hours, we could be getting sleet or snow or something, you know, in that time period. But we've got a full day, full afternoon. And I first want to welcome and introduce Nathan Stock from the Carter Center in Atlanta. We were with him last week, and so he is now making the return visit to Catawba. But he will bring greetings from the Carter Center and talk a little bit about, as we near the conclusion of this activity, where things might be going, and to give you a general overview of what the Carter Center has been working on, not just with North Carolina, but with several other states. So Nathan, the floor is yours.
It's great to be with you today. It's great to see some familiar faces. My name is Nathan Stock. I lead a lot of our conflict resolution and democracy strengthening programming out of the Carter Center in Atlanta. A couple of announcements before I kick off. I do want to recognize some of the Carter Center team that's here today. Helen Laws with her development department. Dana is a program associate supporting our work in North Carolina, and Hank also supports this project. Also want to flag, in case you hadn't seen it, on that table, there is a condolence book that is going to the family of President James Carter. As part of the funerary arrangements over the last few weeks, the Carter Center has been holding events sharing these books and allowing folks the opportunity, should you so choose, to write in a note. There are also prayer cards and Carter Center paraphernalia. And finally, if anyone wants more, there are additional copies of the novel, the only novel authored by the 39th President of the United States, The Hornet's Nest. There are additional copies there as well. So I just, in turn, want to start by thanking President Nelson, College, Dr. Bitzer, for hosting us today. And I really want to thank all of you, the many distinguished members of the Commission on the Future of North Carolina Elections. We are enormously grateful for the time you have volunteered, but also for the expertise that you have lent to this vital work. Most of all, on behalf of the Carter Center, I have to thank Mayor Roberts and Justice Moore, Jennifer and Bob, for their leadership of the North Carolina Network for Fair, Safe, and Secure Elections, partner with Catawba College in this effort. Jennifer and Bob could have posted into a well-earned retirement, and they did not. So did I. Posted into a well-earned retirement. Instead, they chose to bring their drive, their experience, and their love of country to this work. For this, we are enormously grateful. And beyond that, the Carter Center deeply appreciates the partnership formed with Catawba College, as well as the North Carolina Network for Fair, Safe, and Secure Elections. And as Michael alluded to, we are excited to continue to support this work as the network integrates with Dr. Bitzer's Center for North Carolina Politics. For the Carter Center, and for me personally, this feels like a kind of well-deserved graduation. From my perspective, overseeing this programming across 6 US states, it is the equivalent of the North Carolina network spreading its wings and leaving the nest. And moving to live under the auspices of a wonderful new home in North Carolina. And I would note that for the Carter Center, this has always been part of the plan. And it's really exciting for me personally to see it come to fruition. I mean, to wind the clock back a little bit, you know, Jennifer and I first connected before the 2020 election, right? And she was one of my very first hires on this national project. She helped connect us to Bob. She was there in early 2021 as we began to conceptualize all this. But the core idea that animated Carter Center then as now was that we could help to organize Americans from across the political spectrum to support our electoral democracy and counter. We knew then, today, that most Americans are with us in this. Most Americans want to live in a prosperous, stable, representative republic. The task before us has always been to figure out how to give our fellow Americans, fellow North Carolinians, the tools to realize that shared vision. And that may mean sharing facts about elections through the Trusted Elections tours that the commission has run, through the work of this commission. Beyond that, the Carter Center has maintained a focus on ensuring that there are local institutions that can carry this work forward in the long term. For us, that makes the partnership with the North Carolina Center for Politics and Public Service really an ideal fit. We are supporting networks somewhat similar to the North Carolina network in 5 other states, in Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And across those states, we are exploring prospects for, at some point, localizing those bodies that we've set up, either perhaps as independent 501c3s or in partnership with other local institutions. And as usual, in this regard, Jennifer and Bob are leading the pack. I mean, they are, essentially the first network to take this step, which for us is super exciting.
Guinea pigs.
Yeah.
Leaders, I think is.
Leaders, let's go with leaders. But last thing I want to say is just to underscore that for the Carter Center, the transition of the North Carolina network to this new home at the college is not going to be the end of our involvement in this state or in this program. For one thing, we expect to be in a position to give small grants to the Center for Politics and Public Service annually to support some of the ongoing programming of the network. But more broadly, we envision bringing Center for Politics and Public Service, the network, into this existing set of partnerships that the Carter Center has with currently networks in 5 other states and maybe more in the future, right? We just had a big gathering in Atlanta last week that Dr. Bitzer attended along with Jennifer and Bob, where we brought all of these teams from the Upper Midwest, from the Southwest together to compare lessons learned to plan for the future. And our vision of this longer term partnership, even as the network transitions to live at Catawba College, is that we would stay connected with this ecosystem of organizations working together to strengthen our democracy and counter violence, including through training, technical assistance, conferences, messaging, and so on. So for the Carter Center, this is not the end. It is rather an exciting new beginning, and we are delighted to see what comes out of the gathering today. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Nathan, and on behalf of the college, thank you to the Carter Center for supporting this much needed work. as well. Nathan did talk about the Center for North Carolina Politics and Public Service. That's a new initiative well, we're actually underway with this meeting. We've done some programming last year. We're going to continue to move forward. But one of the key things that I'll be looking at as the center's director is how can we take this initiative and continue the work? I think it's going to be vitally important for us to continue to focus the state's attention, our citizens' attention on the importance of elections and the administration of fair, safe, and secure elections. We're going to have conversations with the Carter Center about how we can best do that. But it would really help me tremendously. If you look inside your notebooks before you, you'll see a sheet that basically says, as you listen to today's final meeting and the commission concludes its work, what do you think future initiatives should focus on to continue this work on elections in North Carolina? I would love to have your ideas, your thoughts about this work that needs to continue in this state. The center is going to be focused really on two major activities kind of related to its name. First and foremost, kind of a repository of what the state's politics is like. I think, having the data, having facts, seeing trends, as you'll note in the report, is a good thing for citizens to know about their state's politics. But the second component is, I think, just as important, and that is promoting the value of public service. All of you have given your time, your energy to public service with this commission. You've done it in other ways. The center wants to promote that value of public service to our citizens. Because in order to have good government, you need good people in government. And so combining those two aspects, I think it makes a very natural fit for this initiative. While we are coming to, I would call it graduation in that regard. We're graduating today with the activities that we're pulling together. But what are we going to do into the future? And that is certainly something that I would love to get your input, your feedback as you hear things today, or thinking about what you're hearing from the report and the various findings. Let me know in particularly if you have specific ideas, jot them down, and I would love to have them collected at the end of the meeting for that. You'll also see a second piece of paper behind it. What would you like to ask Judy Woodruff? This evening after our dinner to celebrate, along with several members of the Catawba College Board of Trustees, we're going to have the event at 7 o'clock, a conversation with Judy Woodruff. And I've got some questions, but I would love to have your perspective to engage with her as well. So if you've got any burning questions for somebody who has worked for PBS, NBC, CNN, run the gamut, and has a very long history of, again, public service in journalism to our society, would love to have your comments, your questions for her. We'll try and sneak those into the hour-long conversation, but please let me know if you have any burning questions for her as well. The other item before we get into the report, I wanted to share, and Chris and I got this literally Friday night at around 6 o'clock. So we are still trying to digest all the data, but we did another YouGov survey. If you remember last year in August, we surveyed 1,000 North Carolinians for their input, their feedback, their sense of confidence and integrity, along with a lot of questions about basic election administration. We decided to do a follow-up one. And Chris was very kind to join in with the Hare Institute for Public Affairs that he runs at Western Carolina University. So Catawba and Western Carolina sponsored this survey. It went out to 1,500 North Carolinians. But I just want to quickly go through some of the key points that I think is kind of important, just to kind of set a tone for what our fellow citizens think about North Carolina and its elections, the confidence that they have. You'll see on the second page, kind of a little bit of detailed information about the survey. If you want more, if you're a data geek, come talk to us. We'll talk your ears off about the methodology and whatnot of the survey. But again, I would emphasize there at the bottom of that page, we should think about these results as being informative, not definitive. I think that's one of the things a lot of people don't truly understand about public polling. It's supposed to inform. And so this is kind of informing us about the perspectives, particularly from August to January. This first question, regardless of whether your candidate or party wins or loses this election, how confident will you be in the safety, security, and integrity of the election in North Carolina? Kind of at the heart of what we were doing over the past year and a half. You'll notice in August, 71% said very or somewhat confident of all respondents. In January, that went up to 80%. And I think that speaks again to the health and how our fellow citizens really look at the integrity of our election system. You will also see partisan change. And I note there, all the respondents were asked, do you identify as a Democrat, an independent, Republican? We give you that information as well, but you see considerable change from August to January, something that Chris and I are going to be very interested in exploring more about. But I think as you look at these questions, kind of see the trend lines, the dynamics at play. Just quickly turning to the next page, I'm going to give you all time to look more closely at all of the questions. But the one that also struck me of great interest, how important do you think it is for losing candidates to publicly accept the winning candidates as legitimate winners in North Carolina? In August of last year, 84% said very or somewhat important. In January, 91%. And it was pretty much consistent across the partisan identifications. This gets into a lot of the questions that you all also asked from the August public opinion poll that YouGov did on how you see your county voting, how you see the state, how you see nationally, how much confidence do you have in the election workers, poll workers, the staff at the local level, at the state level, and then a variety of activities that are prevented, but also those that you have confidence in. So I'll leave the results to really kind of speak to themselves. If you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out to myself, to Chris. Be happy to talk to you. But I thought it was important that you all got the first view of this. We'll be sending this out as a press release from the college and from the commission, along with the center, along with Chris's institute, and hopefully get some public engagement and discussion going as well. Because elections don't end necessarily. There's always a new election. We will have elections this year. We will have important elections next year. Elections are yearly activities. And so it will be interesting, and one of the goals for the center will be to continue this kind of public surveying of North Carolinians. A lot of these questions we want to try and track over time, see where the confidence is. If there is fluctuations, what then can we also potentially address? So the main bulk of what we're going to be doing today is focus on the final report. And with that, I want to turn it over to Jennifer and Bob for their introductory comments.
Right. I get to go first.
As always.
My first question is, are people on Zoom hearing okay? People on Zoom hearing okay?
There's nobody so far.
Nobody said anything? Okay.
Okay.
I just wanted to make sure because I didn't see it on the side. Always
Still
making
have-
sure. Well, the first thing I want to say is, we pick up This is your work. This is 11 committees meeting over a year and more, because a lot of folks did meet after the election or did it on Zoom or whatever. I mean, a year and a half of work and a lot of editing with our law student, Jessica. Thank you so much for helping on that. But, and I'm sure there's still a few typos, just don't notice them. But this is an amazing collection of the cross-partisan work that you all committed to because you care, because you know that we're not gonna survive unless we have a democracy that works for everyone, where people feel like they can be heard, that they are heard. And when Bob and I first got started on this way back when we got called from the Carter Center, we thought, you know, what is the kind of the basic underpinnings of democracy? That is elections. That is how we choose our leaders. We have to trust that. We have to have access to that. We have to feel like that makes a difference and it counts. And that is what, you know, we have been looking at in North Carolina. We know that every of the 50 states has a different way of doing it. It was really fun learning about the fact that North Dakota doesn't require you to register to vote. I don't know how they do it. If anybody moves there, let us know. But you know, just that there are 4 states that have no early voting. Like seeing where North Carolina fits in the great scheme of things and how different states are, and yet they all have a system that works for that state and that state's culture. And I know that, you know, we got 5 other states working with the Carter Center. I want you all to know that when Nathan said North Carolina's leading, we are actually being copied by people in Georgia and Florida and Arizona and Wisconsin and Michigan. For a lot of the town halls that we did. Arizona had a commission that was, I think it was supported by the governor. The great thing about this commission is we're not beholden to any elected body, right? We're a group of 60 individuals, cross-partisan, young, old, academic, business, student, nonprofit, a huge mix that looks like our state. And we're gonna present something. We'll talk about that at 3 o'clock, what comes next, how we present this and to whom. But this, we hope, because of all that, has a very nonpartisan, cross-partisan flavor that can be trusted to be a true voice of the citizens of North Carolina. And that's a big accomplishment. I mean, I think we should give ourselves a hand. Yeah. That doesn't always happen. And one of the things that Bob and I heard a lot of in the town hall tours, we had Republican, Democratic Board of Election members sitting on the panel, looking at each other and going, yeah, we look at provisional ballots, we pretty much agree 90% of the time. In fact, there was one group where the people on the Board of Election members had been there like 12 years. And we asked them, y'all ever disagree? And this, one of the board members said, way back in 2006. Like that was how often they agreed. She remembered the one time they didn't. So that is, again, part of building a democracy that people believe in, that trust, where everybody's voice feels heard. And I think that's a huge accomplishment. So I just wanted to, you know, thank everybody for your time, your commitment. It's a lot of Zoom calls. This is our 3rd in-person meeting. Some of you had to travel from far away. And even though this is a delightful town, delightful college, and we're so happy that Catawba is a partner in this, but thank you all. Thank you all for doing that. And please do sign the condolence book. Take an extra copy of the Hornet's Nest, which is perfect because this is the Hornet's Nest area of our state. We all know that Revolutionary War reference. If you don't, you can ask my husband. He's out there studying. He's a big supporter. Also, one more thing that we didn't mention about Judy Woodruff, she had a special relationship with Jimmy Carter. And so what we're also hoping, you know, having covered him over the years, reporting on him and actually having a personal relationship, that'll be interesting to hear tonight as well. Personal relationships absolutely matter. And what I loved sitting here was watching folks talk to each other, you know, across party lines from different parts of our state and finding common ground and finding that we really do care, that we have a system that works. If everybody keeps participating, it will continue to work. one of the things we said today, the three of us were on Charlotte Talks this morning, and we said democracy is not a spectator sport. And we want to make sure other people in our state know that and appreciate that as well. And so I always talk too long. Bob, I want Bob to talk about the beginning of all this and have your remarks as well. But I just want to make sure everybody really felt the thanks, that we, this was a huge team effort. Everybody was part of it. I still remember individual conversations with folks about different aspects of our elections. And it just gives me great hope. After every one of our town halls, I left feeling so patriotic. We stand for something right here, right now, and we're gonna keep working on it. With that, Bob, my counterpart.
Since I've already been called out for being old, I thought I'd bring my cell phone up here and pretend like I have notes on it. I don't, I just brought it up, show and tell. If I spent the next 10 minutes thanking everyone that merits being thanked, it would be like an Oscar award ceremony. But I want to say first to the Carter Center, Nathan and the Carter Center team, that they really have been great to work with. And I'll make an embarrassing confession. I voted against Jimmy Carter twice. And so I felt compelled in accepting this responsibility and make up for that in some small way. But it was an inspiration really to work for the Carter Center and the incredible work they do and the incredible people they have. And I said last night at dinner, I didn't know Jennifer really well when she got me into it as the so-called right-leaning member of the coalition here, but we have worked together so well. It's been a real treat. We have not had a crossword with a lot of challenges and everything, and she is an incredible worker. And I've been fortunate. And our academics, that was maybe the single best idea Jennifer had, was let's get these three involved in this. Where we're headed. But I do want to point this out about the work that you've done and to thank each of you. Believe it or not, this is my 50th year of practicing law. And in those 50 years, I've been involved in a lot of elections in a lot of different contexts. And I don't recall, and I think this is something we talked about when we first came up with the idea of an election commission. Nobody's done this. And you would think, as critical as elections are to democracy and to our state, I'm not aware of governmental units or academic entities that have done the kind of comprehensive work that this group has. And I think we learned on our Trusted Elections tour that, one, the public is pretty uneducated about the system and how it works and the complexities and what goes into it. And as many elections as Jennifer and I ran, we learned something new every single time. And we also came to gain an extraordinary appreciation of the challenges that people who work in the election field, whether they're paid staffers or volunteer judges or whatever the role they may play, it is a huge amount of work under huge pressure and in an area or time frame where more and more scrutiny is on every single aspect of how elections work. And so what you have done in putting this report together, we all know that we could have spent another 3 years working on this, and that you could take campaign finance and do a whole commission just on campaign finance. But we have started the ball rolling, and we have given the public, elected officials, civic groups, nonprofits, business entities, at least a blueprint to look at and start talking about how going forward, we can continue to have fair, safe and secure elections, but to have a kind of a state-of-the-art system here in North Carolina. And I think as everybody knows, between when we submitted the reports and put this together, there've been all sorts of election changes that have taken place. So, you know, it is, as Michael was saying, you know, an ever-rolling tide of new elections, new laws, new regulations, new controversies. But you've got the ball rolling with this report, and, you know, we're just delighted that Jennifer and I could pass the torch off to the man with the best bow tie in North Carolina, Michael Benson.
Well, he was mad somewhere.
Yeah, he's not here. All right,
I want to add one more thing.
all right.
I got one more thing to add. And Michael is gonna be our MC for giving the update on the report in each section. We're gonna start that in a second. But I want to put one more, kind of big picture view on what we have done this past year. Because, the Carter Center is really good at asking us to quantify, qualify, and track everything we do and all the outreach and how many folks are participating. And so they actually had a professional media team watching, and thank you to the folks in the media who helped with this, who are here. But that's how we spread the news of what we were doing. And they calculated from our media reach and the town halls and the commission, all the interviews we did, like this morning on Charlotte Talks, listen to it tonight, you can hear us again. The total media, traditional media, 35 articles, this is by the way on page 161 of your report. 14.68 million unique monthly visitors. Broadcast media, 137 news clips, 1.76 million listeners. Social media, 68,000 people reached, 23 stops across the state. And they have an algorithm for how many millions of people we reach, but they didn't want to give an exact number, but millions of North Carolinians. And whether that was folks reading about the bipartisan nature, how people got along, the boards of election, you know, talking to each other, whatever they read in those media reports, it helped spread the news of what we're doing. And that is also incredibly important. So thank you to all of you who tweeted things or posted on Facebook, gave interviews to the media. We had news crews here, our last in-person meeting. And all of that makes a difference. And what we know now is that I think a third, or maybe more than a third of folks in the United States get their news from social media. And so that's going to continue to be important for us to talk about these real in-person meetings. One of the things I said at each of our town halls says, when you have somebody in front of you who's the expert from the State Board of Elections, you know they're not an AI. Right? And so that kind of face-to-face, in-person, you know, meetings and encounters are going to be more and more important. Like, we can trust that. And we hear someone like Lindsay Wakely talk about the detail and folks on the other county boards and staff, the detail of how they actually counted those votes. We know we're hearing it from the people who are doing it, and it's not fake. So I just think that's really important. I just wanted to raise that about the media reach, because that is how we're going to continue to support our work in democracy. And with that,
And I have one thing,
Add
one thing
one
that
thing.
I didn't thank David and Rachel Chapin, who
Oh,
have been with us.
absolutely.
Data tracking that Jennifer was talking about, I don't do data, so Jennifer and the Chapins did all that, thank goodness.
And
But,
nice
and
graphics.
Jessica for doing
Yep.
our editing on this, that was huge help.
Absolutely. We need people who are good at graphics and organizing. So absolutely. Thank you so much. Over to you, Michael.
All right, so we're going to basically just work our way through with very brief remarks from each of the committee chairs that we have. If the committee chair is not here, one of us on the steering committee who worked with that particular committee will provide the basic findings, considerations that we'll have for each of the 11 groups. So we'll start that momentarily here. Then about 2 o'clock, we'll get an update on the 2024 election, where some continuing issues lie, and also hear from the State Board of Elections. Lindsay has joined us today, so we'll get a good overview and update on their activities working so far. And then after a short break at 3 o'clock, we will have a discussion about where this needs to move forward. This is going to be critical to continue this work. We're not going to ask you to continue to be in meetings like this and to do Zoom meetings, but at that particular time at around 3, we'll talk about, would you be willing to serve as kind of a sounding board, an advisory group for future activities and what we need to continue to work on into the future. About 4:15, we'll wrap things up. After that, we will have a reception downstairs in the lobby for everyone. Judy is hopefully on her way from Durham now, where she had meetings over the past couple of days. She'll be arriving here on campus. If she gets here in time, we'll have her come over, join us for the reception. And then about 5:30, we will leave from here and literally just walk across the street over to the Robertson College Community Center. It's where we're going to have Keppel Auditorium, where the event at 7 o'clock will be, but the dinner will be in a lounge area, the Peeler Crystal Lounge, right next door to the main auditorium. So we'll have dinner with a number of Catawba College trustees and administrators to kind of celebrate our work here this evening. Then at 7 o'clock, we'll convene in Keppel Auditorium for the conversation with Judy. That'll probably take about an hour, hour and 15 minutes, and then we'll call it a day. So that's just kind of a real quick run through. Any general questions so far? I'd like to pause, just to make sure my students are with me. And if you need bathroom facilities just down the hallway, right before you hit the water fountain, you'll see men's and women's restrooms there on your right. Okay. With that, let's see.
Ballot security.
We will start with ballot security.
Always good to go first.
There you go.
Exactly.
We got
Exactly.
both. We
Come
got
on
both
up.
chairs.
I gotta go there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Both our co-chairs here. Thank you, Stephen Pate and Harley, for your work.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm James here with my co-lead for the committee on cyber security, really infrastructure, think hardware, software behind how elections work is where the most bulk of our focus was. We really were in charge of herding the cats, if you will. We had a great team. See Mary Ellen here, who also participated. I don't understand how some of you did 2, 3, 4 committees. Definitely, that's amazing work. But we met in July, and the bulk of the report that's in there now, we were probably about 75, 80% there in July when we met. And, last couple of months, we tied up the edges, but our big ticket items really didn't shift too much. What did shift, and we'll talk through this in the bulk of my time, is while our big ideas didn't really change that much, the public's concern and prioritization of those ideas did when you compare pre-election versus post-election. As you can all imagine, ideas and opinions shift, and that's what we saw in the conversations. I got a firsthand view. I'm a poll worker myself for Wake County. So I worked, this is my first presidential election. I picked a doozy to go in for my first one. But really cool to be part of the community there in Wake County and Apex and seeing them. And there's some takeaways. There are conversations that happened at the polls, inside, outside, observers change. My first experience this year with what they call external observers, which I didn't know was a thing until this year, vice internal observers. They were a lot less moderated, a lot less controlled because they were outside the building, but added a certain flair to the election process. But quickly, I'll go through kind of our big items. There were 3 that we briefed in July. They're in the report. We actually have 5 items at the end of the report, but we kind of grouped them into 3 main topics. The first one, again, ours was technology focused. And our first big concern that voters have and that we saw that needs to be addressed is really just understanding the technology. generally speaking, the technology behind elections can be quite complex to those that are not technically savvy. And so a lot of question and doubt in our process stems from people just not understanding the technology. They understand if you put a dot on a paper and you give that to someone to count, that their vote is counted. Once you put that piece of paper into some sort of computer, they lose all faith in that the right thing is going to come out the back end. And so one of the first ideas we took away was a lack of understanding in the technology that makes our election work. Steve and I are very technically savvy. We work in that world every day. We understand how the boxes work. So it's not that big of a leap for me to see and have faith in that box. If you're not from that community, a lot of people have huge doubts that it does what we say it does, that it's not connected to the internet, those sorts of things. So understand the technology, security in depth, and what election committees do the entire year, not just on election day, but the entire year to make sure our elections are safe and secure. People have no clue that we do that. And so really the back end of that is there needs to be an education campaign for Joe citizens so they understand how those elections work. Number two, confidence in ballot chain of custody. Again, we did the technological side of where the ballots go in. And there's a whole other side of, once the ballots come out on how that election committee takes those and makes sure they're secure all the way till they're counted and validated and audited at the end of the election. And so lots of problems with people having confidence in how elections are secured the entire process. And the third one was transparency and voter list maintenance. So those voter rolls that contain all the registered voters in North Carolina, lots of concerns on who controls that, who vets it, who validates it. How do I know that my information is correct, isn't corrupted? How do I know that my neighbor, who I believe is not legal, that he's not voting illegally? Were huge concerns coming in, and sort of that 1, 2, 3 is where we saw things pre-election. Technology, and then ballots, and then kind of voter rolls is where we saw things. Post-election, a little bit of a shift, quite a big shift actually. Same 3 kind of big buckets of ideas that people are concerned about, but the ballot chain of custody rose to the top pretty quickly. And knowing that, trusting that the dot that I put on there was the dot that was counted. My big role in closing down our precinct on election night was I was the guy who counted the ballots. I had someone who backed me up, who was my second set of eyes, who could math better than I could, but I was the one who made sure that the numbers we've been tracking all night were the same numbers that matched either our spoiled ballots or what was in the ballot box. And so we knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the numbers they gave out of our tabulator matched our paper ballots. There was no way you could confuse it, but that is not good enough for someone who's reading something on Facebook or Twitter that, there are, 500,000 bullet ballots in the state of North Carolina that are only voting for one candidate, which we know, look at the raw numbers, that's not true. But when that post gets 1 million views, it gets legs. And so we saw the idea of confidence in ballots really rise to the top as the number one issue. And then right behind that closely was transparency and voter list maintenance. Lots of questions on who can and cannot vote, who's legal to vote, are the right people being allowed to vote? There are still court cases going on in our own state about ballots not being counted with the Supreme Court, looking hard at military ballots, absentee ballots. And so these questions are still around on who is allowed to vote and who is legal in our state. And so we kind of saw the ballot chain of custody and then transparency and voter rolls really rise to the top as the top 2 concerns. And so in closing real quick, kind of where I see our topic area kind of going forward and ways ahead is we need to work hard on transparency in all aspects of the election process, from counting votes to changing and updating your information in the voter rolls. Is the public needs to understand how those processes work. They need to be public. They need to be advertised. We need to do education campaigns. People need to, the month before and the month after election, have extreme confidence that their process works. The only way we can do that is by opening the doors. And I know in most counties, we do that already, but we need to do more. We need to, really educate our voters on how the policy works and if they have a voice in that policy. I mean, we do public audits in Wake County. I think every county does, as well as public showings of how the equipment works as we do validation testing. We invite the public to that. Usually nobody shows up, but we need to do a better job at getting people out to watch those public showings of how our equipment works. The biggest thing, every election, and probably hit every one of your committees, is funding. dedicated annual funding to our election process. Usually it's often done through grants, and, non-traditional process where you don't know every year how much funding you're gonna get to support your elections. And so, we've done things through CARES and HAVA. It's not always certain exactly how much funding is gonna come in. And securing your elections is not free. It takes people, with the skill set of a Dr. Steve over there to come in and around the clock, 365 a year, they're working to secure elections. That's not free. And so we need to really nail down funding to support that type of security work. And then lastly, on helping voters to understand where they are in the voter rolls, are the regular campaigns to have people check their voter roll, check their own registration to make sure they're on there. I don't know if North Carolina had much of an issue, but I know other states had a lot of issues with voters being kicked off their rolls, within the 90 days before an election. So always, regular media campaign to remind voters to go and check the registration. So hopefully I say, well, kind of within the 5 minutes, but pause, any questions, comments for us, which I'll divert to Steve probably. Please ask away. Okay.
Great, thank you, sir. All right, next up, campaign finance. Blake, well, let's see.
Mary Jo's
Mary
not here.
Jo's
Blake,
not
you
here.
wanted?
You have, or Bob, do you want?
Bob, you wanna?
Well, actually, Lindsay is the expert.
Do we wait?
Your recommendations.
Well, I'll make one quick point, and then those of you, like Susan, are you on campaign finance too? And Blake, the report essentially sort of lays out the process with the single biggest recommendation being the understaffing and funding. When we met with Lindsay, and you'll meet Lindsay formally, but she is assistant counsel to the State Board of Elections and runs the campaign finance office. So you talk about a huge amount of responsibility. But the one thing that jumped out from our conversation was that the software they're using is 20 years old. And I assume that hasn't been updated since we met. And so in the enormity of the campaign finance world and the number of reports, the amount of monies, the complexity of the laws and regulations, we have a very small but extremely competent staff at the State Board of Elections that's responsible for it. And am I correct that local boards are not, they don't?
They do. So it's a little bit of a balance. All the enforcement really falls with the state board, but in terms of intake, processing, and even auditing of some municipal candidates, county level candidates, that is still done at the county level. And you have drastic differences at the county level on how that's handled. Some of the larger counties have full-time staff. Most of the smaller counties that have 1 or 2 staff members to begin with obviously do not.
So would that be correct, Blake, that this season, the single biggest issue coming out was a lack of public knowledge about the rules and understanding? And I won't quote Lindsay on this, but somebody told me that the General Assembly doesn't really want to delve into redoing or reworking how campaign finance works in North Carolina. And it's a huge task. So anyway, anything else that?
No, I
wanna
think
add?
the only thing I would add on top of that, I know there was a lot of discussion in our meetings about the training for folks who are reporting. I know that I think that treasurers can also be candidates. That was a topic of conversation. So just concerns about the compliance there, the training there, educating the public about who can and can't give and contribution limits and how that changes. It changes every biennium. And then, there was also a topic of conversation about, with reporting, right? With the advent of technology and being able to maybe do some auditing or flag concerns. But ultimately, there's gonna need to be people on the other end of that process to vet whatever technology spits out or to make the certain judgment calls that need to be made.
I'm not putting you on the spot, Lindsay, but could you ballpark how many campaign finance reports and how many millions of dollars technically sort of flowed through North Carolina?
I don't know that I have a number on how many dollars flowed through North Carolina. Certainly, we're still in the process of processing the final reports for the 2024 election, which just were due this past month of January. But we're actually unclear on exactly how many committees we have operating in North Carolina today because we don't have a unified system between the counties and the state. We know we have over 2,000 committees registered with the state of North Carolina. Unknown how many at the county level, but obviously it's a large volume. So there's a lot of activity that is going on. And you know, obviously a large amount of money that does fluctuate from year to year.
Susan? Good. Thank you, Chair.
All right, candidate filing and qualifications.
Yeah. Talk about this one. So the candidate filing and qualifications committee, we don't have a lot of hard recommendations, but I don't think that should be an implication that the committee didn't take their work seriously or that somehow we didn't discuss it. I think where we kind of left off was we've sort of got areas of concern or areas to pay attention to. And so one is this sort of massive rise in the number of unaffiliated voters in the state of North Carolina. We don't have quite the same rise in unaffiliated candidates, and the ones that do run don't tend to be very successful. And so we had a lot of discussion about to what degree unaffiliated candidates should or should not be able to have easier voter ballot access, right? I mean, there's a positive case to an affirmative case to be made that says that it should be a lot easier to register as unaffiliated, to run as unaffiliated, that we would then have an electorate that more closely resembles, folks running for office who more closely resemble the electorate. Of course, the downside of that is if you make it too easy, then you're gonna have ballots of 30, 40 perhaps candidates running at the same time. So I think kind of where we left it is sort of recognizing that this tension exists, leaning into the tension to some degree. I think we feel simultaneously okay about where the rules are, but also that we don't like the underrepresentation of unaffiliated candidates in general. We also have talked some about what this means for unaffiliated folks on boards and commissions and all the other ways in which we get represented through the electoral process. That's sort of a one we think, keep an eye on. We talked about redistricting a lot. This is a shock. We don't have a magic silver bullet to solve redistricting in America. I don't know. We had Andy and everything. But we did talk a lot about what that would look like. Obviously, you could have a whole commission, and many states have, about what better redistricting might look like. Andy Jackson here has a very thoughtful proposal that he wrote up for the Locke Foundation before the commission even began its work that I encourage folks to look at it. So we summarized that a little bit on page 31, just the bullet points of it. But I encourage people to read through that and also pay attention to, as the lawyers and some of the other folks in the room know, North Carolina has this peculiar, in some ways, but positive in most ways, rule about our General Assembly districts coming out of the Stevenson ruling, which essentially says that we come up with a base map, we cluster counties together, and then we draw districts within that, right? Once those clusters are set. Does that reduce the possibility for folks to gerrymander or do bad things? Of course it does. But does it minimize it? I think we think that it does. So I think Andy's proposal and the committee in general feels like the Stevenson ruling is a good thing, and that continue to pay attention to these traditional redistricting criteria makes a lot of sense. And I think that is probably, I think that maybe the other sort of point to draw folks' attention to, I think we're gonna see this threaded throughout a lot of these subcommittees, is the massive amount of turnover we've seen in county election directors. So what we have in the report is 61 changes in the last 5 years across North Carolina's 100 counties. 61 counties out of 100 in 5 years. And so when so much of the candidate filing is done at the county level, and you have brand new directors, Swain County Director, for example, fresh out of Emory, he's great, fresh out of Emory University, like takes his diploma, walks to Swain County, next thing you know, he's an elections director, he's gotta deal with what it feels like for folks to be filing. So that kind of turnover, we don't have a silver bullet on that either. We think it's something we need to pay attention to, and I think we're gonna hear that in other committees as well, how to think more about getting stability in the ranks of election. Okay, did take any questions? Thank you all.
All right, thank you. Let's see, next we have challenges and lawsuits. Jill, do you have?
Yeah, Justice Orr, will you do this one with me? All right, is Justice Edmonds here? Do you know?
He is teaching the class, but will be here for the social events.
The third part. You did the third part. So we did post-election challenges, which is obviously a problem right now.
Which we didn't anticipate.
No, we did not, and it isn't really covered, except in the appendix, which was very well done. So one of the first problems that we saw, is that there's really not a lot of attorneys that represent election challenges that are not partisan. It's really through the parties that you are getting legal help towards elections. That's a problem not only for independent voters, but in general, you are coming with an advocacy bent. And we need a lot more. This is a bigger problem also for large law firms, for instance. They don't want to get involved in the drama, so they have also kind of stepped away. And we have a lack of help of election legal advocacy here. So more attorneys, whether that is at the law school level, at the state bar level, but we definitely need more election-related legal help throughout our state. The second issue that we dealt with was about how to challenge a presidential candidate under our Constitution. Any other position in North Carolina, you have to file a notice of candidacy, but for president, you don't. So I really liked the example that was used in the report. What if the No Labels Party, for instance, nominated a 23-year-old Canadian? There would be no way for a North Carolina resident to challenge that presidential nominee. How would we get that person off the ballot? That is really unanswered in our Constitution, which is a problem. What happens if, for instance, Donald Trump runs as vice president? The Constitution federally would disallow it, but how do we challenge it here on our ballot, and how would we keep him off it? And then the third one, I'm gonna defer to Justice Orr, if you don't mind doing it. Much more legally complex.
Yeah, well,
Article 6, yeah.
yeah, there's this unique provision in the state constitution in Article 6 that says if there is a challenge to the election of an Article 3 office, which is all your council of state, then the General Assembly will decide who won the election. And this was first brought into play back in the early 2000s in a race for superintendent of public instruction. And for those of us who thought we knew something about the state constitution, it was like, what? I mean, the legislature gets to decide who won. And as it turned out, they did. They put together, the legislature put together a set of rules. And the current statute says that any litigation is terminated and the decision of the legislature is final and can't be appealed, which may be problematical from a legal standpoint, but that's what the statute says. Now, I think when we put it in the committee report, we were anticipating in advance of this election, we could have potentially a very close council of state race. And next thing you know, it would be over in the legislature deciding who won it. That didn't occur. If the Supreme Court seat was fell within it, then that would undoubtedly be over in the General Assembly right now. But the issue is the statutes and the rules have not really been addressed, and most citizens don't even know this provision exists. And so the reason we felt it was important was going forward was that people take a look at it, because in a closely divided state, we're gonna have a council of state race that
It
is
is a
decided.
ticking time
Yeah,
bomb.
that's
He's
right.
being nice. It is
Yeah.
going to cause a tremendous problem at some point in time.
Yeah, and you talk about undermining confidence in the elections, you know, if all of a sudden this statewide election is now over in the General Assembly to decide who won. So that's why we put it in there. And just real briefly on the second issue about challenging presidential candidates, you know, the whole Kennedy deal really kind of opened up the fact that there needs to be a process. And we didn't say, or nor do I know what that process should be. But if someone is not qualified under the Constitution to be president of the United States, but they're potentially gonna be on the North Carolina ballot, there needs to be a process. And so that's why that was in there. Can I ask Lindsay one more question?
I'm multitasking,
Thank
so I
goodness
apologize
you're
if you
here.
beat me down.
The difference between a challenge and a protest. Is there a distinction that it seems like?
Timing is a big part of that, so a candidate challenge is gonna take place really sort of on the front end, and a protest is gonna take place more on the back end, so that's a big significant distinction, there are
Back
different
end.
procedures. that-
As in before the election?
Mm.
Like challenge happens, like you would challenge a voter.
A voter challenge, I'm sorry, a voter challenge as opposed to a candidate challenge.
Yeah.
Different, there's a different procedural process for both of those if we're talking about election protests versus an actual challenge of a voter, that's gonna take place. Both of those are gonna potentially result in some ability for the county board of election to have a hearing, potential appeals to the state board in the case of a protest. So there are some appeal differences there when we're talking about candidate challenges versus protests as well.
That's another one of those
So-
multi-years.
So you're saying the Griffin Riggs is a protest?
Yes.
Even though they're they're not really challenging voters because they didn't do it beforehand.
Right, it's proceeded as a protest.
Okay, thank you. It's a good job.
Yeah, one thing I think is-
Any general questions? On that? All right. Next we have civic education. Jim?
Jim?
or-
Okay, well, then, I thought you were gonna present Jim. I do apologize. Let me go to the civic education. So this was a fun little group that got together last October when we first started all of this. And people started whispering, "Don't we have a civic education? Why is there no civic education?" Well, it turns out in every committee the two other committees that I was the coach for, civic education, of course, came up. But Jim and others banded together to create this idea of civic education. And I think one of the most important things that they did, and I wish they could have gotten further, I wish I could have gotten more results, is they sent surveys or at least requests to election boards all over the state to find out how many of them had a person or whose job it is to do the civic education. And as you might imagine, this sort of fell down upon the sort of way you would expect, right? With some smaller counties just not able to do it or even answer the survey. So they only had a 25% response rate though. If you look on page 42 of the report. I would love to know that more myself. We know that the state did some advertising for voter ID. You know, I guess that one of the questions among a lot of people is whether or not how effective maybe it could have been, but I don't think that was a committee. That's a hard one to do. And I think we did fairly well. There are nonpartisan groups that do civic education. They're doing important work throughout the state, but they're not always connected with each other. So if we're going to be doing more civic education, that's a really smart idea. We need to, it would be nice if we had a unified voice among nonpartisan groups, or at least some coordination among the groups that are doing it. We need to build, they say, the committee came up with, we need to build stronger and broader relationships for the North Carolina State Board of Elections to provide valid information to all stakeholders, including partisan and nonpartisan affiliates, and conduct further research to see if there is a recommended amount per voter that should be spent on education and outreach. And there is a supplement to the report that I prepared as a part of some other efforts that I've been at nationally to try and encourage more funding for elections that looks at the cost per voter. And it's very high level. And so it's very difficult. What we found in our research is very difficult to find from we have our information on how much is spent per voter from annual financial reports that every county has to file. And those are not usually as so detailed that they say that. And so that's why some more research into this area is so important. Because nonpartisan voter education is absolutely vital to building trust and confidence in elections. I have a couple of colleagues who are doing work in this area, looking at social media, and they've had some really positive results in terms of building voter knowledge, in terms of increasing accuracy of vote by mail, and some other things that those counties that are able to do social media and are trusted election communicators help on a number of levels with building confidence and trust in elections. And we know.
By the way, Martha's work is on page 183.
Thank you. What is shocking, what we found from the very beginning of our research is the massive disparities among counties in North Carolina. And a lot of that stems from the fact that funding for elections comes from the counties themselves. And what we find is that politics can play a role in that. And so it would be my recommendation. Local election officials need a stable, dependable budget for elections. And the other thing is, it's not just politics, but also the economic situation in the county. We found that there was a lot lower spending on average in counties around the time of the Great Recession. And then that persisted afterwards because property was so undervalued. It takes time for a county to sort of evaluate all of the property. So that lasted, and it wasn't until 2016 that we found on average in our work that counties started to recover. So economics and politics both affect this. And politics affects what the state board can spend too, which I talked about. But that's the lack of, in some cases, staff to do this kind of work is a concern. And it's one good reason why the Civic Education Committee wanted to see what nonprofits were doing. Questions?
And in relation to that, I want to raise up, and I'll add it to the appendix. The Charlotte-Mecklenburg chapter of League of Women Voters does a Civics 101 course every year. It's 3 hours a night, 7 weeks in a row. And they have city, county, school board, media, election workers, and they are adding state officials to it because a lot of places in our state, if you're not in Raleigh, you don't get a lot of news about what the legislature is doing. And so that could be a model that could be shared with other League of Women Voters chapters, other civic groups. It takes time to put together the speakers and find the facility and all that. And the league has done a great job in doing that. I know Mary Ellen's active with the league, and there are a lot of folks that we met through the tour. We partner with the league on helping get that word out, and they're doing great work there. So that will be something we'll add to your excellent appendix. It's a good model.
Any general questions?
I have one.
Yes, sir.
Have
Did the committee consider at all that us old guys are a lost cause? And that we need to focus on civic education in middle school and high school?
You know, no, and so actually I put in this is another grant application I put in, I've been busy with those this last year. I want to start working on civic education that focuses on election administration. And I think starting with middle school, because we know that this is about the point where students, you know, they start to take it in and start to think for themselves. And yeah, that's sort of supported by research that you said that actually, because that's what I found in looking at prior research. I think that what we need to do is some sort of, well, we need to study, I mean, again, like anything, like all of these things. We need to look across the 50 states and see what requirements are for civic education. I know there are some, in fact, there are some teachers in Charlotte, for example, I think I talked to somebody from Providence Day. They do, like, she brings in the voting equipment. She brings Michael Dickerson in, who's the director of elections in Mecklenburg County. And she says to them, here's this. And then they talk about counting. She told me they talked about counting the ballots. They talked about ballot audits. So they sort of knew what was going to happen to their ballot, you know, both before and after. And I thought that was just very cool, but not everyone can go to Providence Day, so they will get not that education. And I'd like to see us build that in. Of course, the problem is there's so many requirements for students. Figuring out how that fits in is a difficult question. But thank you. Great question. Yes, ma'am.
I have one thing to say that in Guilford County, and it's statewide, but there's an organization called You Can Vote that the league works with. And they have registered in Guilford County in the last 5 years, approximately 10,000 students who are becoming eligible to vote. And there is just a minute bit of voter education that goes with that, because the students, you know, are given information in preparation for the registration. So we're doing a little bit of it. But another thing that I think we need to be aware of is that since 2000, the emphasis on social studies education has gone pretty much down the drain, because social studies was not tested under No Child Left Behind and under the end of grade testing in anywhere in the United States, but particularly in North Carolina. I know it is no longer not tested. And the hours in the school day where you would have double the number of hours given to math and English and half to science and social studies. Science was brought on board for testing. I don't know if social studies has been in the last couple of years, but about 5 years ago, I know it still was not. That affects civic education quite a bit, because the emphasis is not placed there.
Sorry. I wanted to point out, like, You Can Vote and some of the groups that we're talking about, that we did do, excuse me, an asset mapping. So if you look on page 42, we have a link to that. So we listed all those organizations: You Can Vote, League of Women Voters, Kids Vote NC, and Generation Nation, and all the different groups. But as we pointed out, the key is that those groups aren't necessarily working together. So whereas Generation Nation does work in the K through 12 space, You Can Vote is mostly community space. We're in higher ed, my org, so if we could work together and coordinate better, it would be more effective. I also want to remind folks, if you weren't aware, that our legislature did just pass a civic education requirement this last assembly,
Session, yeah.
session. And so if you want to take a look at that, it's the State Board of Education requires instruction in civic and citizenship education. That shall include the founding principles of the United States of America and North Carolina civic literacy. So getting election engagement in that is, I think, something we ought to look into.
Good idea. I should talk. Because she's great to talk to.
To add to, there's another bill pending to add to that, that was just introduced last week at the General Assembly to add to civic, engagement, civic instruction in, the primary, I believe it's in elementary and middle. So to the extent that there may be, and I don't know the bill number off the top of my head, but I'd be happy to.
There's a new bill?
There's a new bill
Okay, so there's a new bill on civic education.
to add additional,
So I wonder, so last year at the North Carolina Political Science Association, we actually heard from one of the people that was on the committee that developed the requirement that all the public universities have to fulfill, which is the foundation's requirement. So we are required to teach about, let's see, letters from a Birmingham jail, the Declaration of Independence, choice of the Federalist Papers. These are really important things. I don't dispute. My husband my husband who teaches American politics and you'll meet him later if he gets here and see how that works out. But he's over the moon about being able to teach this. But what we're not always seeing is, what do we know about election administration? People take it totally for granted, like, oh, there's my place to vote. And at least this is my observation, my opinion, based on what I've seen. If you ask people basic knowledge questions, and some of our questions were basic knowledge ones, if you're a college student, can you vote kinds of questions. We had, can felons vote after actually, here's one I have right on the top of my head. When you ask people whether or not felons could vote after they completed prison and parole, 18% got it right and said yes. Only 18%. Now, that's probably not a concern for people who have never committed a felony, but if you have a family, but it's taught in school that felons can't vote. I've had students say to me, no, that's not right, Dr. Croft. Felons can't vote. And I'm like, I learned in high school that felons can vote. And I'm like, no, that's incorrect. Here's the Sentencing Project. Here's the Department of Justice. All of these different organizations, they just don't realize. And I have a felon in my, not so immediate family. And it was talking him into knowing that he could register to vote. And trust me, it's okay. You can, you're done. And
that's state law? Is it state by state?
State by state. In North Carolina, and there was a court case, what was it, last year? Do you know this case? They had to, they had after prison and parole, pay all their fees. So, yeah. Thank you for letting me do that.
All right. Thank you. All right, counting votes. Anna Mills and Gil could not be with us, so they've tasked me with giving the final report for this committee. You'll notice at the beginning of our report, we basically dealt with 9 specific issues. And a lot of it was going through and trying to better understand a lot of processes that are typically found in the general statutes, but also potentially in regulations. And so you'll see the list there of the various questions that we've discussed. Certainly question number 7, how are military and overseas ballots counted? We thought that was a fairly easy one. And, yeah, maybe not so much, but we'll see how that plays out pending continuation of legal challenges there. I would just bring folks' attention to page 57 and chart 6.2. We know that North Carolinians love early voting. And this chart gives a kind of breakdown going back 20 years to 2004 and the shift that has occurred with early voting. I would point to the last set of columns there for 2024, 8 out of 10 North Carolinians. Let me say this again. 8 out of 10 North Carolinians voted before Election Day. That is significant. And we're seeing this also play out in midterm elections. If you look, really kind of starting with 2018, 2022, consistently 53%, so over half of the midterm ballots will come in before election day. We'll see what happens with 2026, but once patterns get set and established amongst voters, they tend to stick with it. So that is something I think, you know, with public awareness is an important factor to play into. In terms of our recommendations, again, much like with a lot of groups, we think public knowledge, public transparency, public awareness of what is going on in the counting process is critically important. We did hear we set an entire meeting aside to hear from a representative on ranked choice voting. North Carolina has experimented with that particular vote method. They've decided to go away from it, but that was one area that we could not get consensus on within the committee. The consideration about ERIC or some other organization could potentially help the states compile master lists to ensure one citizen isn't voting in North Carolina and, oh, by the way, casting a vote in Kentucky or Montana or someplace like that. Trying to get more unaffiliated voters into the process as well. And then one issue that arose after the election that we did touch on, and we're not sure, maybe we can get some guidance from the state board about the issue of deceased voters. If a voter, say I go and vote early, like 8 out of 10 North Carolinians, I go and cast my ballot, and I'm walking out of my precinct at City Park, and I get hit by a bus. I know, it's beyond. But what happens to my submitted ballot? Well, by policy, from what we have seen and read from the North Carolina State Board of Elections, if a voter dies within a week, they are to be removed from the voter registration roll. Does that also, in conjunction, if a ballot has been submitted, does that ballot also be withdrawn from being counted? There are some states that do allow dead people to vote if they have legally cast a ballot. Other states don't. Can you give us what you may or may not know about
Sure, yeah,
this
so,
particular issue?
I mean, it's been, there is, I think, room for clarity in the statutes in North
Yes.
Carolina here, and, you know, given, I think, some of the, questions that have been raised about the state board policy, perhaps we will get some legislative clarity this session, but the standard from the state board, and this has come through numbered memos from the executive director, has been that a person's, in order for their ballot to be counted, a person needs to be alive on election day. So, you know, if someone passes away before election day, even if they've already cast a ballot, that ballot should be pulled back out, and not counted. It's been the longstanding. I don't know when we first promulgated that, but it's certainly been the guidance from the state board for a number of years.
I remember the numbered memo and where I think a lot of us were looking at was looking at the statute. And the statute says the registration will be removed, but there's no mention of the ballot within the statutory language. So I think that even though we did not have time to make that as a kind of formal recommendation, that is something I think clarity, particularly due to the statute, would be something that we would propose as a consideration.
I have a legal question. This is a Bob and Lindsay one. Who sues if we want your ballot to count, Michael? Can your wife sue on your behalf? I mean, you're dead.
I'm
Do
dead.
you have standing?
Such your estate.
The executor of the
Executor of
state.
estate.
Would
The
Lindsay
executor.
have, or Lindsay, is that your wife? No. that's-
Andrea.
Andrea have standing to challenge the numbered memo?
Or the executor.
The executor of the estate.
The executor's estate
Spouse.
I assume it would be,
would be the spouse typically.
not that we need to know that,
Yeah.
because you're not gonna die, but.
Don't give her any ideas when you see her tonight. They'll laugh. Any other general question? Lindsay, you want to tackle that? one?
That's a good question. All I will say is that hasn't been presented yet, so I don't think we
So
necessarily.
we're not gonna
have
worry
the
about it
answer on
until.
I will say, we did have, in Wake County, there was a.
In Rowan County.
I think Rowan as well, that
Yes.
is correct. So you had I'm more familiar with the Wake County fact pattern, but you did have a situation where family members basically came and presented to the county board and said, these individuals' ballots should count, and sort of an explanation for why it was important for these individuals, personally for them to cast a ballot in this election, even though they passed away before. It is contrary to the numbered memo that was issued by the State Board of Elections, but the Wake County Board of Elections did allow 3 of those ballots to count. So, that's not, I would not say that is a template for how it should be done going forward, because it is in contravention to state board guidance, but we did see that happen this year.
Isn't that essentially the why they mark mail and early voting ballots individually as opposed to election day ballots?
Say that again?
So my understanding was, mail ballots and early ballots are marked individually, right? And so if Michael has passed away, that horrible wreck, we can go in, we can pull his ballot out for election day,
Yeah.
you're alive, you're cool, so you don't. So my understanding is that we have an entire process built around the idea, which is then playing out in court right now with this Jefferson Griffin thing, because it's on challenging mail and early votes, because those are the ones you can actually pull out.
They're
Is that-
retrievable. Yeah,
They're
which
retrievable,
I don't,
right?
I
Election
think
day.
we're fairly unique in that. I don't think most states have retrievable ballots, but yes, for early voting and for election day, they are. I think that's one of many reasons why they're retrievable.
Gary Cohen claims he came up with that, but Gary Cohen claims he came up with that.
I don't know. Gary Cohen.
Okay, clarification, and this shows that you learn something new, even if you've been studying something for 20 years. I knew that the early votes and the absentee votes were retrievable, but are election day votes
I don't think so,
retrievable?
no.
Okay, that's what I.
Right, Griffin's challenge.
Yeah, of course.
Provisionals.
Just keep in mind, there's a great tradition in the mountains of western North Carolina of dead people voting, so that's the ponder rule.
So, our next committee is early voting, and before I call up Jim, kind of unfortunate timing. We're talking about deceased voters. I just wanted to take a moment and point out in the front of your book that this report is dedicated to Jimmy Carter, but also to Mayor Karen Alexander, who was the co-chair of the early voting committee, came to committee meetings, was a contributor. She passed away the same day that Jimmy Carter passed away, which is really unique. But we felt very strongly that we should dedicate this work to her and to President Carter, a Republican and a Democrat, man and woman, someone local, somebody national, really nice balance. And she was many of you saw her here. She also, when we had our town hall tour here, she welcomed the group to her city. And so we just wanted to point that out. Let's just take a moment of silence for both of our dedicated folks. All right. Thanks so much. And Jim Laurel is the other co-chair for early voting. He's gonna come up and give that quick report.
Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks for recognizing Mayor Alexander. I also want to recognize Susan and Leslie from our committee who are here and who helped. And Mayor Alexander was at the last Zoom meeting we had after the election, so she took part into it until near the end.
Something to that. Not only did she do an outstanding job for the city of Salisbury as mayor, she also was a very talented architect who touched a lot of places in the city today, including this building, the Center for the Environment. She was the architect for. So she was a very special person. She was very dedicated to this commission She did not know, she had no idea until the end of September that she had cancer and died in December.
Thanks. Well, Michael, took some of the thunder away from the early voting part, but, it's,
Does that?
one of the most popular parts of this whole, exercise is early voting. And, as he pointed out, it's done nothing but grow over the years ever since it started. And this past year, there were 4.2 million North Carolinians who voted early. That beat the old record 4 years earlier, of 3.6 million. So as he said, 80% of the people who voted this year voted early, which is pretty remarkable. And nowhere was it more remarkable, I think, than in the mountains. In the 25 counties hit by Hurricane Helene, voters there outpaced the rest of the state in early voting. According to the Board of Elections, through November 2nd, the last day of early voting, turnout in the mountain counties was 58.9%. It was 2 points higher than in the rest of the state. So that's pretty remarkable. And one other thing to note about early voting in general is that Republicans are finally kind of taking their rightful place in this, and more Republicans voted early than unaffiliated voters and Democrats. And as you can probably see in his charts, that's grown exponentially ever since it started.
Page 67 is the chart.
So our committee came to a few conclusions. One is that the current early voting period of 17 days seems about right. Adequate for most voters. North Carolina is in the middle of the range of US states in early voting. So second thing is there doesn't seem to be an urgent need for early voting to start any earlier than it does. 17 days, again, seems pretty reasonable. Third thing, it's reasonable for the state to have guidelines about the number of a county's early voting sites tied to the population of the counties. For example, in March, in the primary election last year, large counties like Mecklenburg had 15 days of early voting at 24 sites. That equates to 1 site per 33,000 voters. And then you had Bladen County, which has only 22,000 registered voters, had 1 site for every 5,500 voters. So it's a little disproportionate in that. Another conclusion was it is reasonable to require at least 1 weekend day, preferably a Sunday, for voting during the early voting periods. Voting period, the 17-day period includes 2 weekends, so having 1 day on a Sunday seems pretty reasonable. And the last thing is that the location of early voting sites is important for voter access. In some counties, sites had to be moved further away from colleges and universities, for example, making it harder for students to access sites. And one of our committee members was from Henderson County, and I think they had 1 early voting site, and it wasn't in Hendersonville, it was in the northern part of the county. Or it wasn't, no, I'm sorry, it was the reverse, it was in Hendersonville. And a lot of the population of Henderson County is now in the northern part near Asheville. And so it was harder for those people to get to the early voting site. So again, some of these things cost money, and as James said, securing elections is not free. So making them convenient is not free. So maybe there could be some changes there. Anybody have any questions?
I do, Jim. Julie. Trying to figure out where that chart is, but it looked like that there was a big flip between early voting and in person, 06 to 08. Is there a reason for that, or I don't know if that's something you can look at, but it's quite a difference.
Well, I think the 2008, I don't know exactly. The 2008 election was pretty historic and drew a lot of people out, and I think a group that encouraged early voting that year, and the Democratic Party certainly did.
Technology also did change that year.
It was a campaign strategy
Yeah.
that really changed.
Oh, that makes sense. I just wondered because whatever it was will we see something like that again? We saw it this year, but, okay, thank you.
Jim, this may not go to your committee, but it's a question that's come up. If 80% of the people vote early, and those are all retrievable ballots, correct? Early voting. Why don't we just make every ballot retrievable? Because now you have an issue and we'll talk about it in a minute, but.
That may be beyond my scope of knowledge. I don't know that I have an easy
Okay,
answer.
I,
to that
well,
one,
I,
but
okay, I
certainly
throw
have-
that out there. It seems
Are you
inconsistent.
trying to make it easier to pull ballots back?
Well, you know, I mean, it's unfair to say one group can have their ballots pulled
Well-
back, but another group, because they're non-retrievable.
Well, so,
Can't
so,
call it that.
so they're retrievable. And correct me if I'm wrong, because we do same day registration.
That may be the rationale, but I'm just talking about the practicality.
So,
because-
like,
yeah,
let's,
yeah.
I mean, cause what I'm hearing, this is a norm and expectation that our ballots are secret.
Right.
And they're not. And that's problem. I see you exchanging looks, cause I don't know, but so one wonders if they should all be secret.
Not retrievable.
Not,
And
no
not
retrievable
retrievable.
ballots.
Then you can.
We're saying we can't review them ever for challenging it?
Yeah, do a village challenge.
This is,
So
This
maybe
is
that,
some-
but I think it's a policy question, it's a values question, it's a political question, it's not a.
this is also the only time I've ever disagreed with Bob Orr on Twitter was on this very issue.
Considering the volume of our tweets, it's not good.
I mean.
But the question is, you know, can you treat one pool of voters differently from another? And that's essentially what you're doing.
Yeah.
You know,
An
so-
equal protection.
Yeah, and you know, we may get to the day where 99% of the people vote
Right.
early, you know, so. but,
Well,
yeah.
and I remember somebody asking me at one of our town halls about early voting, you know, those being retrievable, that means someone can see how I voted, right? So I don't have a secret ballot.
We don't have a
Well,
secret
you have a
ballot.
secret
Yeah.
marking ballot. They have the
Confidential
ability
ballot.
to.
I was told by Wake County coordinator that Wake County stores all the ballots for each election for at least 10 years. Which made me wonder, well, if you're storing them, and you go back in and look at one.
They put a number on it, so.
They put a number, yeah.
Surely indeed.
Not trying.
Right, well, there's something from Michael's new institute.
There you go.
Tax.
Research coming.
Okay, moving on. It is a little after 2. We've got 4 more committees to try and speed through.
Yep.
So,
Okay,
infrastructure.
I'm here to talk about election administration and infrastructure. And I'll start with the first concern that we had, which was safety. So we talked a lot about that and had some recommendations for it, but the new addition to our report is that in fact, our fear of violence was much greater than what actually happened. In fact, when we reached out to the Board of Elections, they weren't able to give us any sort of exact numbers in terms of intimidation and those sorts of things, but we do know that there were 8 incidents that actually were sort of escalated in terms of violation. So in your appendix on page 163, we added the Bridging Divides Initiative from Princeton's report. And that report actually detailed, not just in North Carolina, but in other places, the nature of the kind of incidents that we're seeing. And what was interesting about the 8 cases that went forward to the Board of Elections is they were actually more on the electioneer campaigning side. And our fear had been the observers would be sort of intimidating and that sort of thing, because they have more leeway, of course. And so, yeah, you can look at that report and see the sorts of things. So, you know, yelling at voters, refusing to move out of restricted areas, photographing curbside voters, standing a little too close to folks. So these are things that were sort of happening out in that electioneering space. So when you think about 8 incidents or even 10 incidents out of 2,650 polling places, 360 early votes, obviously our fears were far overblown. However, I'm gonna insert this as a person who was a chief judge at my location. What I think you cannot measure is the potential for a chilling effect. I had my first set of observers, were under the impression that they couldn't talk, that they, were supposed to sit behind my folks and sort of take these, vigorous notes. Like, I was like, what are they writing? What's going on? And then they left. But the next group, they came in and they were a little friendlier and they knew that they could come and ask me questions, but they would come and ask about everything, which goes back to civic education. They didn't know what was going on. Was that being challenged? Why did they go over there? So it kind of made us nervous, right? So I do think that there's a bit of intimidation potential for having the observers there. And so I think clarification for the parties to know what they can do, clarification for the election workers to know what we should expect as well, is I think something that's gonna need to happen. The other concern, their question that was raised for us post-election was, where did those reports go, right? So we know they were party driven. And so that was one of the questions we asked the Board of Elections, and they weren't sure, because what's all those notes? Where are they? Is something gonna happen now, later, that we weren't anticipating? So we'd love to know sort of now what happens to that information. But again, it did surface for us the fact that, thankfully, our elections were safe. And so we were really happy about that. We still have our recommendations that our legislature, if you one of the 18 states that has actually passed some laws to have some more safety for folks. And then we still think it's important that we're educating and having task force of police and other folks to be on guard for elections in case something would happen. Our other area that we were looking at, which has been spoken about several times, was the staff retention and career development, the 61 out of 100 directors turning over. And so we, of course, had lots of suggestions about how we could create sort of pathways for college students to be interns and other things to start to see that as a viable career. Obviously, we think that there needs to be more support systems for new election directors, mentorship, and all of that. But our new addition to the report is we did a salary study, my friends. And it would not surprise you to know, and you can find that on page 76. No, it's in the appendix.
No, it's on.
It is on 76, page 76. It may not surprise you to know that they were second to last in pay for county folks. Right above, God bless them, folks who work with seniors. And so clearly the salary issue is, we studied it, and there's lots of flexibility. You know, some directors could make 200,000 and some could make, I think our bottom was
14 something an hour?
Yeah, yes, $10 something
Like,
an hour.
yeah,
So
it was something very low. I don't
very
remember off
low,
the top of my
but it's
head,
in the
right?
report. So clearly there needs to be something done about how we can support smaller counties to ensure that folks
And
are.
I want to give a shout out. That was Mary Jo McGowan led that research team at UNC Charlotte, and I participated. We got salary data for a long period of time, 2012 through 2021, and looked at it on average. How did election directors fare compared to other county directors? And it's as we feared. Okay,
It is as
sorry,
we-
Leslie, please
No,
continue.
absolutely. And then, of course, the ever standing challenge of poll worker recruitment. And so, of course, we discovered that 48% of jurisdictions reported difficulty recruiting, larger counties, more difficulty. And so you might recall, we said this the last time, but we developed our overarching recommendation is what we're calling recruitment across the lifespan. We need to expand the student election initiative where high schoolers are part of it. As I shared that one of my elections couldn't have happened without those two students there. We talked about the need to do incentives and programs and internships for college students, right? And then we talked about who are the business folks who give release time for service, and other businesses and organizations when folks are at that stage of their life. Are there service learning hours and things for college students, going back to that? Then when we get to older generation, is it possible that we could use retirement communities and all of that? And overarching, and on top of all that, was we need more persistent, creative recruitment processes, right? Has anybody seen a commercial to recruit you as a poll worker or an ad on social media or something? I mean, we've got so much access to folks now, and we need to do something like that. We talked about maybe a youth-led campaign where the youth that are actually doing it recruit other students. And then finally, we again added in this whole election expenditures, looking mostly at the salaries. But, and so we talked about the State Board of Elections creating an emergency fund in case there's pandemics and other things. Obviously, that was an issue this year, where there was an unexpected hurricane. And then we talked about the need for, oh no, what I wanted to share was we still have an outstanding question that's interesting for us when we think about the cost of elections and administering them. And it's been alluded to throughout the day, and that is the more litigious our environment becomes, the more expensive, the more misdirection and redirection and everything that's happening with our folks that lead elections. How much does that cost? And so we did reach out to the Board of Elections, but they don't have hourly billing like private firms and that sort of thing. So they couldn't give us some exact numbers. But when we talk about administering our elections, not just the time, the resource, the energy that our folks are being having to devote to all of these challenges and things, but then the cost is an outstanding question for us. Any questions?
One, you had posited that, you know, the observers, which are now baked into our process, come in, they observe, and then we have no idea where, I mean, we know where they go. They go into their partisan observers, they go in their partisan vaults, and but no one does it. Could we not, or could the legislature not, at the county level, require, since those observers have to be registered, right? So we know who's coming in, could then also require an exit report after the elections?
That would be
That
nice.
is a good question. That's a good recommendation. Yeah, we could either have it operationalize that, but.
Yeah.
Other question?
I don't know, but let me just give a special shout out to, well, I mean, obviously Leslie has been great on this. I remember the day that she said, recruitment across the life course for poll workers. And I'm like, write it down. But let me also say, and I'm so glad you brought that up because I just thought that was the best way of putting it. Let me also give a shout out to Shara, who started working on it right away and did poll worker recruitment among her bar association, and energetically worked to provide materials from her county and talk about what was going on in Wake County so that we could do some comparison across other counties. So I had 2 chief judges on that committee. Loved it.
And Sharon's been doing this for what, 20 years?
04.
Yeah, 04. There you go. Wow.
Wake County Bar Association has agreed to do CLEs on this to recruit attorneys to work.
Nice.
It'd be very helpful.
Nice. Good job. Good job.
Thank you. Mail-in ballots, Shawnee could not be here. Something unexpected came up, so she asked me to report on the mail-in ballots again. Kind of like with counting votes, we did a deep dive into the processes when it comes to mail-in voting. And one thing I would draw people's attention to there on page 89, the party breakdown, we have seen a considerable shift in mail-in ballots. It used to be heavily Republican, 06, 08, 2010, 2012. It has now shifted. And so certainly with the exception of 2020 and the noted dynamics of that election, typically mail-in ballots tend to be about 3 to 5% of the total ballots cast in an election. But again, with North Carolina oftentimes seeing razor edge margins of victory, that 3 to 5% could have a significant impact on election outcomes. You'll note on page 100, kind of the bullet points, again, kind of focusing on public awareness and education. We, speak for the State Board of Elections and county boards, they are dependent upon a third-party actor, and that is the postal system. And so oftentimes the dynamics that potentially for mail-in ballots is at the mercy of a third party. So we have to take that constantly into consideration. One of the considerations discussed and debated amongst the group was exploring centralized drop-off location. And again, they would have to be secure. They would have to be, positioned where the integrity of the ballots could be protected. A real critical question amongst the group that we discussed. The final issue that again kind of came up late in our process, there on page 98, we have a section addressing ballot preparation deadline. Not realizing that we would have I don't want to use the term challenge because it has a particular notation to it, but one candidate seeking to have their name withdrawn from the ballot when ballots were already printed. Brought, some post-election discussion about who is going to be responsible for paying for those reprinted ballots. And so there is a number of considerations for proposed policy changes, one of which is to potentially clarify the statutory deadline for ballot preparation. We know through other committees' work, things like logic and accuracy tests have to be done. The revamping of all the ballot designs have to be done when you are printing ballots. It's not like, as I discussed with some folks who didn't understand the process, you can't just go down to Kinko's and say, hey, I need 5.7 million ballots reprinted. It's just not done. So perhaps giving some clarification, not just for the counties, but for candidates to know by this deadline, if I don't get my act together, I'm on the ballot, period. So to have that, as a possible consideration moving forward. And we list some of the anticipated benefits, but also some potential challenges with that kind of policy revision. Any general questions I can answer on behalf of the bill? Did I kind of capture all the key things? I think you were.
I think there was a lot of discussion about, and in your facts, your graph showed that there's so many people voting in person early as opposed to the people, is that a continuing trend, you think? So moving away from mail-in and going to early voting, which seems simple unless you're up in some cove up here and you have 3 trees across your driveway.
Right. I think, the pattern is very clear over the past 20 years. The shift to in-person early voting is clear. I have been wrong in the past. I could be wrong into the future. I think it's a safe bet that we're going to continue to see the majority of ballots cast in person early. Thank you all very much. Primaries and election day. Chris. All right.
I'm at least proxy. I got that one. So yeah, primaries and election day process, I think. So first of all, I sort of made this half joke, half serious thing last time I was here. We spent a fair bit of time at the beginning trying to figure out if our chart was about primaries and election day processes, or whether it's about primaries and election day process. And that actually is kind of an important distinction if you think about it, right? Are we really trying to get at the entire primary process? Are we trying to get at what's happening when people show up and vote on election day? I don't know that we ever even came up with a final answer to that, but we puzzled over it for a while. I think one of the key things that really Shira, I think, provided a lot of people to our committee, but particularly Shira on this one, is just reminding the fact that we need to remind folks about what she kept calling the ballot journey. And I think that is one of the key takeaways here. So this is bring a little bit longer write-up than some of the others. And I think part of it is because this is, in my mind, a very good explainer about the ballot journey in North Carolina. And I think the reason for so much time that we spent there is because we feel like folks don't really understand this. And I think this has been hit on a lot of times throughout this whole day and throughout the whole report that, we're sort of all moving from the idea that more communication and more information is ultimately going to build confidence in the process. And I think there's probably no better example of exactly where that's going to happen in here. We did, talk about ranked choice voting a bit, and we either foul tipped it or punted it. I don't know which sports metaphor I want to go with. We didn't quite say, look, we think it's a great idea, we think it's a terrible idea. We said, kind of like the other committee did before, that we have actually experimented with ranked choice voting a little bit in the state of North Carolina, in Hendersonville, and in Cary years ago. The General Assembly no longer is given us the power to do that, and so we just, didn't say whether it's good or bad. There's a really nice table in here though about pros and cons. I think those are really good rundown. We talked some about North Carolina's semi-closed primaries, which I think we've noted in the committee. Sometimes folks incorrectly refer to as semi-open. It's actually, the technical term is semi-closed. What that means is if you're a Democrat, the Democratic primary, right, Republican primary, unaffiliated, you get to choose your own adventure. And so that has some real effects on where we go as a state, on how people actually choose to register to vote. But if we didn't decide that this is a bad thing, it needs to be changed, but the awareness of it should probably be be brought up a little bit more. We talked some about runoffs, and again, didn't come to a final conclusion for what the magic number should be, but I think for folks who haven't thought about this issue a lot, we've experimented. First of all, runoffs are pretty much a Southern phenomenon. It's like Sundrop and RC Cola or something, I don't know, NASCAR, but
Cheerwine.
So the Southern states put these in for not very good reasons, to disenfranchise people of color over a century ago, but we've kept them. And so most states in the South kept that at the 50% mark. North Carolina dropped from 50 to 40 to 30. That has had real effects. Obviously, runoffs are not free. And so we had some runoffs this last time that did not have great turnout, but did actually give us different winners. So ultimately, is that mean we should have more runoffs or fewer runoffs? I don't think we have a collected opinion, but we do think that people do need to sort of think about this more. And then, thanks to one of our other committee members, we also spent a good bit of time thinking through what election day processes, primary election day process means for accessibility and voting machines. And so Tara did a great job kind of helping push our thinking in smart ways there. And so encourage you to look at this whole section. That section in particular probably moved my thinking, frankly, than any other section of this particular committee, because I think oftentimes we're not thinking about physical accessibility. I'll say I'm not often thinking about physical accessibility when I'm thinking about voter access as the primary goal, but I think this section really talks about how important that is, why it's important, and then I think why the ADA is really one of the most important federal pieces of election administration legislation ever passed. And so I encourage folks to think about that as well. So.
And I think
Question?
James mentioned the chain of custody,
Yes.
and that really starts even earlier. I know when I pick up those ballots, I have to sign off on them, the number I have, and I have to make sure they are all accounted for by the time I return at the end of the election night. So then it continues on down that chain of custody. And I can tell you, if I'm off one ballot, I'm getting a call or visit.
Other questions?
Signature verification. So we were hoping to get, and actually, Lindsay, I keep putting you on the spot. Sorry about that. I hope they're paying you overtime for this. So one thing, so the state board had pilot program mandated by the General Assembly about signature. And so there was promise that data was going to come out, and I think where we left, we weren't sure exactly what the evaluation process looks like. Maybe
So there was actually a report that was due to the General Assembly. We were a little backlogged in getting that out. I'll be honest, I didn't draft it and I haven't read it, but it has gone to members of the General Assembly. So that is available and certainly something we're happy to provide. And that did sort of provided an overview. It wasn't sort of a live pilot program for signature verification. We were not going through a signature verification process while we were reviewing the ballots. We sort of had a set group of counties kind of review the count going through that signature verification process. And that's the results of that are what we have captured in the report.
Do you
And
have
how
the
that works.
data? Is
No,
it
it looks-
possible? We'd like to,
See
I
that.
think Chris and Michael and I would love to
Yes,
play with the
to the
data.
extent we provide it, certainly can work on.
Okay, thank you.
Great.
Well, I guess we need to do an email and do an official request
Make
for
it a
that.
formal public
So
record
it
request
goes
to
in
the
your
extent-
little, yeah.
Is that something that AI might take over at some point?
Well, isn't it?
It is, so, you know, there is software, typically that is the preferred means of doing signature verification nowadays, is really have a computer program that's doing the matching, and then also have a set of eyes on it to the extent there's questions about whether or not that's an appropriate match or not.
If you ever have the opportunity, like Denver, I toured the Denver election board years ago, and they do a really good job with signature verification. And it's fascinating to watch. And they've got people that, you know, so they run it through AI basically, and then they've got people in the corner, and if things look like maybe they don't match, they send it to these like professional signature matchers in the back. And it's a incredibly expensive, but really interesting process, I think. And it's interesting to me too, that it comes from Colorado, a state that we tend to think of as having more left-leaning election policies, yet they do have signature verification. It does seem to, at least explicitly, you're saying.
And we have not seen any, you know, we don't have any indications right now from the General Assembly of if they want to move forward with signature verification in North Carolina. I think if we were to do that, I think it's still important to note that North Carolina would be in a very unique spot if we do both the witness signatures and the signature verification. I think we'd be the only state in the nation.
Yeah.
And the photo ID.
And photo ID. Yeah.
I mean, it's like belt suspenders and hoops.
All right. Thank you very much. Last but not least, voter access and registration.
No pressure to be too fast.
Speaking of AI, let the acolytes of AI tell it they'll be doing all this stuff. As long as they don't do the voting, as long as the AI will do it.
Yeah.
So I'm voter access, and registration. There's a lot of overlap with what's been talked about before. There's no need for me to belabor the point too much. I do want to talk about, in Cumberland County, where I am in Fayetteville, you know, we see these issues crop up like all of us have. And I think Judge Orr referred to it as that Kennedy deal, which is where Kennedy took his name off the ballot was trying to get off, and that affected us a lot because we have a lot of, you know, we're home with Fort Liberty, so a lot of overseas voters, a lot of military voters, and our election workers really had to scramble during that whole thing. So it's an ongoing process, as everybody here knows. The North Star guiding our committee was we wanted to identify what barriers exist to North Carolinians who fall into certain groups that traditionally have barriers to voting. This information about our reports are 127 to 130. Want to follow along? We looked at several different groups, people with disabilities, senior citizens, voters who were felons and are now eligible to regain their right to vote. I can share what was said earlier or agree with what was said earlier that a lot of people believe felons cannot vote. I first started becoming aware of this as a journalist was whenever you have a candidate like an Obama and frankly like a Trump too, that stirs up a whole lot of new voters who've never voted before. We start getting calls, Mr. Pitts, you know, I had, you know, this on my record. Can I still vote? I was like, yes. And I explained qualifications. So this is it is a question that's on people's minds. We also looked at college age voters and more transient voters like our military folks at Fort Liberty and elsewhere. A lot of our suggestions align with what we've heard already. A lot of it, there's a huge role for civic education. And I see that also with whatever the political climate is, more of the low-hanging fruit. We had more adventurous suggestions, but with the political climate, what it is, I think maybe we can convince people on a bipartisan basis to put some more funding behind public information and civic education. So that crossed several areas, we talked about, like for instance, felons voting, for instance. When people are released, oftentimes voting is not the very first thing on their mind. There is getting employment, making sure they have a roof over their head. So they do get some information, but we can make that a little bit more robust and more clear how they can get their voting rights restored. Of course, of young folks, it's been talked about how civic education can help them get up to stuff on, you know, what's available, what they can do. One data point from the 2024 election, there was a lot of talk before this election that, you know, young people could swing this election. Not in North Carolina. We had, if I'm not mistaken, I think the number for 18 to 25 was 57%. And that was the worst voting demographic. And next lowest were 26 to 40, and that was 61.1%. Now, yes, they're majorities, but those aren't great numbers. Now, seniors doing what they're supposed to, 83% voting according to the State Board of Elections figures of eligible voters, that were 66 plus. So, you know, when you see young people not engaged in the process, if those of you who know church, has been to church, it's like when you see a church and there's not a lot of young kids in the church, what's gonna happen to the church? Eventually it's gonna go. And I feel like young voters, we don't see a lot of them in the booth, what's gonna happen to our democracy? So there was a headline, I wanted to read that because it stood out to me. And North Carolina, I have to get more data on this, but I'm pretty sure we trail even other swing states when it comes to our young people voting. So in other states, being a swing state encourages the young folks to get out, but not here as much. So we got to ask ourselves, how is our church looking? And the last thing I would say, we also recommended in terms of Eric was mentioned here. We want to adopt the system. We recommend adopting the system that can compare, you know, our voter list to those in other states. Eric has already become, I'm not exactly sure how, a little bit politicized. So there's some hard positions already, but some way of tracking that would be great to eliminate confusion and to let people know what their rights are. In terms of people with disabilities, we recommend that curbside voting be available to the greatest extent feasible at least one site in all counties. Maybe we have that, I assume.
It's at all sites.
Okay, all sites, and so expand that as much as possible. I can say in Cumberland County, that it runs very smoothly from my understanding, and it's a winner. Lastly, we also looked at expanding language translation services. You know, for people who are, you know, obviously English is their second language. I did find that while in terms of ballot, Spanish is the only one that can be offered currently, the state website does offer translations in 16 languages, including Arabic, Chinese, Russian, and Hindi. So that was new information. And as I say in the report, enabling this voter self-sufficiency relieves a burden of responsibility on the English-only staff and volunteers and encourages participation. In any way we look at increasing voter access, making it easier for people, it would be nice, and one of our long shot recommendations was maybe have some staff who may deal with people whose English is a second language, or who may be an older person with disability or a person with disabilities. But again, that requires a funding commitment. And that's basically it. So any questions? Yes, sir.
And this is actually something I had brought up months ago, and I apologize I didn't follow up on it with some folks, is North Carolina, you can't take possession unless you're a near relative of somebody else's ballot, absentee ballot. But there was a court case, and I want to say it was 2022, that under the Americans with Disabilities Act, anybody can take possession of a disabled person's ballot. We already have a system in North Carolina, multi-partisan teams that are Republicans and Democrats usually working together to help folks register to vote, request absentee ballots. Have y'all considered either, I don't know if this would be required to have a change of statute or not, but having a procedure set in place so that multi-partisan teams could go, like going to assisted living facilities and collecting those ballots? That would help folks out that way.
I don't know that we addressed that, Martha. do
We
you?
didn't address that, but
Yeah, I'm sorry.
don't you, when election staff go to, say, a senior living
Well,
facility?
these are volunteers.
They don't take a
They,
team with them, they would be enabling voting, but do you know
Say that
anything
again.
about- I'm just, what happens when local election officials go into a senior?
So
living
we
facility?
have the multi-party assistance teams are what gets sent into that assisted living facility.
Okay.
So, they're gonna go in, they're gonna help with the request for the absentee ballots, they're gonna potentially help with the absentee ballots themselves. I think you might be talking more about having those multi-party assistance teams actually collect the ballots as
yes,
well.
that would be like the last step. which
Yeah,
hopefully
it's right now-
procedurally they can do.
Right now, it's really a situation of they have to still be mailed. They're not taken and brought back to the county board of elections by that multi-party assistance team. But I think that would require a statutory change.
We think
And
it would require a change in statute or not?
I believe so.
Yeah, I think it would too.
believe so, yeah.
And is that recommended?
We did not.
I'd love to speak to that. Our organization was involved in that lawsuit because what we were running into is that there was a statute that prohibited the owners or staff of adult care homes and any congregate living facility from assisting with ballot, either procurement or actually completion. So they couldn't, it was hands off. In terms of people, so nobody could even get like a pen, they couldn't get somebody to carry it down the hall. So it was quite a accessibility challenge. That was the emphasis for the lawsuit, and that's why that law changed, to make it so that people in congregate care facilities could get assistance by anybody. And the MATs are wonderful, they're just really, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, very underfunded and they're a lot of volunteers. I think during COVID, a lot of folks backed away from it, so the MATs are great, it's just there's not enough.
And I think demand is a huge part of that. Even when we were, and we didn't end up using them extensively in Western North Carolina as part of the Helene response, but even there were a lot of questions, and a lot of thinking through of what would it take to send to sort of the full volume of folks who may be requesting it under those emergency circumstances. And I think what we see is they're a great resource, but because we don't have the funding, even in non-emergency circumstances, we're not using them very extensively.
So I think Karen told me that they didn't use any multi-partisan, no state level MATs were utilized during Western Carolina.
We didn't have any state level. I think there were some
There were county
level
ones.
officials who were appointed by, I think, specifically Watauga County to go out and do some work there, but we did not ultimately have anybody from the state board level.
Anyone else?
I actually just, I'm sorry, did you?
We need to move to the break, but
Yeah.
quick.
I want to talk to Tara.
Okay, all right, thank you, Myron. Nice to meet you. You've heard a lot. We've had some great discussions. What we're gonna do now, we're running behind, okay? We'll take a break. Let's plan to reconvene at 3. Maybe, let's take about a 10-minute break. Get up, stretch. You can go walk on one of the balconies. Again, restroom facilities, just shortly down the hall. And then we will hear from Lindsay and maybe condense some of the latter time for that. But we will be done by 4:30 because, hey, the reception starts at 4:30 and we won't be there at 4:30. Okay? So 10 minutes and we will reconvene. I know that we are behind, but we want to save time and give her the full time that she would like to share with us from the State Board of Elections. Lindsay is going to provide a lot of good information for us to to further consider. And so we'll just truncate some back end comments and discussions, particularly if you could as well, let me remind folks again, be thinking about where we should be heading into the future. What ideas would you propose for us? And we'll also talk towards the end about further communications with this group and with others moving forward. I'm going to ask Justice Orr to introduce our guest speaker today.
I asked to do this because Lindsay pointed out, we've known each other for 18 years. I hired Lindsay Wakely right out of Elon College as a paralegal for the Institute for Constitutional Law. She worked there. She went on to law school at UNC, then worked in the legal counsel's office, Governor McCrory. She is the Deputy General Counsel to the State Board of Elections. You've been doing this, what, 8 years?
6 years.
6 years, and is in charge of campaign finance. She is a rock star. She's got all the answers. And give Lindsay a big welcome.
Thank you. Well, I'm gonna abbreviate my comments a little bit because I think we've actually covered a lot of what I wanted to make sure we highlight in terms of.
Okay, so we're on Zoom and the camera's pointed here, so.
Let me take. Keep my laptop with me. My
Yep.
notes here. So thank you. So, talked about the 2024 election, and I think you all have sort of highlighted really the key theme for 2024, which was change. So there was a lot of new things that had to be implemented in this election. There were a lot of also unanticipated things that required both our county boards and the State Board of Elections to need to pivot. Some of the things were more challenging than others, but I think at the end of the day, we can say with confidence that all of our county boards of elections and our state board really did a great job of making sure this was a successful election. So I think we've already kind of highlighted this fact. We had 73% voter turnout, which is down slightly from 2020, but I think that's really consistent with what we saw nationwide. But a good, strong election for North Carolina, huge turnout for early voting. And really, we still have, yes, we do have one contest that is still sort of moving through the process, but otherwise, everything wrapped up very cleanly, very simply. We did not have any major issues that we really had to navigate this year, which is great. So, obviously, we've touched on a little bit. We had significant statutory changes this year with the implementation of Senate Bill 747, and of course, also photo ID. While we've had photo ID for a couple of elections now, this is the first general election that we have had photo ID fully implemented. And it wasn't necessarily intentional, but it really worked out, I think, to our favor that we had a slow rollout of voter ID, starting with the 2023 municipal elections, then moving on to the primary, then moving on to the general election. I don't have a solid statistic right now. I don't know that we've crunched this number yet for the general election, but we know that we had roughly 99% of voters show a valid voter ID in the 2023 municipals. We had the same experience with the primary, and I'm fairly confident that once we have that data point, we'll be able to say the same thing for the general election. And part of that is the diversity of IDs we have available. We had over 100 different student and employee IDs that were approved, in addition to driver's license and tribal IDs and the other permissible forms. And because we did have a rollout across municipals and primaries in the general election, by the time we got to the general election, we really had county staff who were well-versed and prepared to work through the issues. So, we worked out some of the kinks with things like the reasonable impediment form. So all of that was able to progress really smoothly, I think, through this election. And a key part of that too was also the outreach that we were able to do. I think it was mentioned before, the state board did have a information campaign. We worked with a private vendor to hit traditional media, but also to hit social media, digital media. And it helped significantly to have funding available from the North Carolina General Assembly for that. We had funding both for the 747 implementation and also for voter ID implementation. And that really did go a long way in, I think, helping us make sure we had voters as educated as we possibly could be about the changes that were coming this year. All that to be said, there was a lot of things that we didn't necessarily see, didn't necessarily that was gonna happen this election cycle as well. We had a statewide second primary, which was, those happen, but that is not a common occurrence. It was simply for one party, so that was the lieutenant governor race and the state auditor race, that we had the second primary for, and that was statewide. Statewide second primaries have challenges. First and foremost, we need space and we need people, and we usually have to do that on very short notice. Counties, are not necessarily going through the process of getting all those spaces reserved ahead of time. We don't necessarily know what we're going to need, right? If we end up with a governor's race in a second primary, we're gonna need different sites than if we only end up with a couple of smaller races. So, quick turnaround on that. We had the primary on March 5th. The second primary took place on May 14th. As expected, low turnout. And anytime we talked before about the secrecy of ballots, anytime we are talking about a low turnout election like that, that becomes a very big issue for us. If we have a precinct where only a handful of people are voting, it can be pretty easy to start working through and figuring out who in that precinct and how they voted. So there are some challenges that we still kind of work through on an election to election basis to figure out how can we combine data to make sure that we are preserving that confidentiality of the vote. So that information isn't readily accessible online. So, that continues to be a big challenge for us whenever we see these sort of low turnout races, but certainly for a statewide second primary when we're not talking about, governor's race being on the ballot or a federal race being on the ballot. Talked a bit earlier about what happened with the We the People Party. So that was a significant challenge for us this year. We obviously had gone through a lot heading into the summer in terms of the recognition of the We the People Party, as well as Justice for All and some other parties. We had probably more parties recognized in 2024 than we ever have before. But really very close to when ballots needed to be going out is when we first got word from We the People Party that they were going to be moving backwards on having a candidate on the ballot. So, initially the timeline for that is Robert F. Kennedy announced on I think it was Friday, August 23rd, that he was going to be withdrawing as a candidate. But at the time that public statement was made, it wasn't very clear where. So he said he was going to be pulling back from battleground states. Are we a battleground state? That's depends on who's conducting that analysis. But we did not get any formal notice from We the People Party that they were looking to withdraw him as a candidate until August 29th. And that's a challenge. I think it was hit on earlier here. That's really a challenge we have under the existing law today. There is a lack of clarity when we're talking about this party process. What is the deadline for which the party has to make a final decision on withdrawing their candidate? It's not clear in the statute. What the rules say today is it is up to the board to determine whether it is practical to have the ballots reprinted. State board held an emergency meeting as soon as we got formal notice from the party about the withdrawal. Board made the determination that no, it was not practical, because at that point we did have ballots that were already printed. We had ballots that were going to the printer. And for us, I think it was hit on again earlier, it's not as simple as going to Kinko's. It's not as simple as working with, our own printers. Ballots are not printed, most cases by the county office themselves. And we work with largely Printellect. Printellect is the largest ballot printer in North Carolina. They have roughly 80% of the contracts for the state, but they are prepared to print ballots on a particular timetable in North Carolina. After they print ours, they move on to other states. So, there were just challenges with even having their availability to be doing any sort of printing. So, the board made the decision that it did, that it wasn't practical, and that it did end up working its way through the court system. So we ultimately got a ruling from the North Carolina Supreme Court. Not a lot of detail in that ruling. I mean, what that ruling told us was that, and I'm gonna quote from some language from the opinion, that printing new ballots will require considerable time and effort by our election officials and significant expense to the state. But that is the price the North Carolina Constitution expects us to incur to protect voters' fundamental right to vote their conscience and have the vote count. That doesn't really give us a lot of guidance going forward, right? So, we knew we had a candidate withdrawing from the ballot, days before those ballots needed to go out, you know, they have to be sent on September sixth. With a ruling like this, what do we do if it's on September fifth that we get notice? It's difficult for us going forward, I think, without some statutory clarification on where that's gonna land us and how that needs to proceed going forward. Ultimately, because we had a Court of Appeals ruling on September sixth and then a Supreme Court ruling on September 9th, ballots went out about 2 weeks later than we would have anticipated. It's difficult for us to say if that had any impact on absentee ballots. Did that cause more folks to decide they want to do early voting as opposed to an absentee ballot? Maybe. We don't have data on that. But it is something I think that remains a concern for us going forward of how do we need to navigate that in the future. And, you know, in general, having gone through the process for party recognition this past year, some additional definition around how that needs to work, what's probably going to be beneficial if the General Assembly does decide to take a look at that at any point in the future. And then, of course, the biggest pivot that had to occur in this election was Hurricane Helene. It's hard to think back that those two events actually happened in the same month. We had the withdrawal of our RFK as a candidate pretty much 2 weeks before, or 3 weeks before we had that storm hit in Western North Carolina. A huge number of counties that were impacted. You know, the initial survey from our office in looking at the impacts is we had 13 counties that looked like they were going to have severe impacts from that storm. The board acted to do an emergency order to provide flexibility in terms of early voting sites, early voting plans, poll workers, that sort of thing, to make sure that those counties have the ability to move forward with voting as close to the ideal as possible. General Assembly then did decide to expand that grouping with their own action, took it from roughly 13 to 20 some. Although I don't think we saw anywhere near close to 20 counties really implementing that flexibility. It was, you know, beneficial to have, I think, a broader group of counties moving forward. But it really wasn't just those 20 some counties. So, you know, in addition to the counties that were directly impacted, we had additional needs to really provide support across the entire state. We had a huge population in North Carolina that was at least temporarily just relocated to other parts of the state. So part of the flexibility, both provided by the state board order and by the General Assembly, included things like if you are living in Mecklenburg County, your absentee ballot can be returned to the Mecklenburg County Board of Elections or transmission back to your home county. So really, we were talking about something that required all of our county boards of elections to really step in to make sure the election could move successfully, which, you know, again, requires retraining of workers. They are used to seeing an absentee ballot from another county show up at their office and say, we're not accepting this, right? So we had quick training, quick record keeping, reporting on all of that data that needed to happen very quickly, not just in the affected counties, but statewide. I can't speak enough about how great a job our Western counties did do in moving forward and handling this correctly. We had very limited impacts. In fact, we actually saw higher early voting turnout in some of those Western counties than we saw in the rest of the state of North Carolina. Part of that was dedication of staff, but it was also partnerships with emergency intervention that made a huge difference there. To be able to stand up a lot of these voting sites, it required everything from Starlink internet access portals at the County Board of Elections to porta potties. A lot of porta potties were needed to be just, you know, deployed to all these early voting sites just to make sure the services and facilities were available for that. We ended up with several tents that were set up to facilitate in-person voting in Western North Carolina. And we used resources that we had at the state board office. We had developed attack response kits to deal with potential cybersecurity attacks. We quickly had to figure out how to repurpose those. So we turned them into basically, you know, disaster response kits instead. Did learn some lessons from that in that, you know, those are really based on cell phone networks that obviously were not necessarily in place. So we are working on updating, updating what we do there to make sure that we're prepared for the next disaster. But we have 10 of those that we were able to quickly get from one part of the state to the other to make sure that we were able to continue keeping the county board offices even going. So they were able to process voter registrations and that sort of thing. So can't say enough about our county directors and our county staff and how quickly, and many of them were personally impacted during that disaster too. I mean, we had individuals who lost their homes, whose communities were absolutely devastated, and they kept showing up for work every day. Even our regional director for Western North Carolina walked to the Buncombe County Board of Elections several miles every day just to make sure things were still going the way they needed to. So, you know, it does speak to, we talked about the fact that there are 61 turnovers in directors in the last couple of years. Both the new, both and the old are dedicated. And it's important to recognize how integral those folks are to the process and for us to be able to keep doing this successfully going forward. Talked a little bit earlier today about the enforcement side of things. I do want to touch base on that as well. I work primarily with campaign finance, but I also do spend a lot of time working with our investigators and our investigations team at the State Board of Elections. We did a lot pre-election with outside partners and particularly with law enforcement partners to make sure that we were educating law enforcement on election laws, on security issues, and making sure that they were prepared on what do you do if you get called to a voting site. So we partnered with law enforcement to develop a law enforcement guide, so literally a pocket book that was distributed to law enforcement officers across the state as an easy reference guide. We also worked with to develop a training program specific to election law. This was a kind of a web-based training program that was made available to law enforcement before the election. All of those were decisions that, you know, things that took time, things that took resources, things that we hadn't necessarily done before, but I think all of those were very productive, you know, for us at the end of the day. In terms of disruption issues at the polls, truthfully, I think the largest disruption issue we had reported to us was stemming from the parties at the polls events. We had a lot of phone calls about the DJs being too loud. If that is the biggest thing that we are dealing with on election day, that is a good election day. And a lot of that was, you know, I think you mentioned before the unofficial observers, so to speak, the electioneers, you know, a lot of that was largely stemming from them. It wasn't really even having a direct impact, I think, on the voting so much as it was inhibiting some of the electioneering activity. So that was, you know, good news to us that was one of the most common calls that we were getting. We did have some challenges this year in terms of campaign signs. Campaign signs always tend to be a hot button issue. But we had some signs specific this year from different groups that were really trying to communicate to non-English speakers about the requirements around citizenship. And that was kind of an issue we had to really work through at a fairly granular level in terms of making translations to signs and trying to weed through what is permissible and what is impermissible. And just the slight variation in word choice really had a huge impact there. We had some signs that simply communicated, you are not a US citizen, you cannot vote. Those are fine. There were objections, there were concerns, but you know, our job is to focus on, you know, does this rise to the level that it could be viewed as election interference? And the determination was no, it's an accurate statement of the law. But we had some other signs that were also distributed that used a slightly different phrasing that was really talking more about foreigners can't vote. So then we had a little bit of what does that mean for people who might be naturalized citizens who have the ability to vote? So, you know, we instructed our county boards to take those signs down when they appeared at polling locations. And I don't know that we ever fully identified what group was responsible for those signs. We did talk to some folks who I think at least purported to be representatives of that group. And I think they understood it. You know, I think having an open dialogue on something like that goes a long way. And I don't think it was necessarily intentional. It was, I don't know what they used to translate. I don't know if they used a person or if they used an application, but whatever it was, that slight variation in word choice did make a difference, I think, for how we viewed it and how we believed how voters would view it. But just having that open communication with our counties to make sure that we're being careful about, you know, what it is that we are and are not regulating is very important. And because I do focus on campaign finance with the State Board of Elections, I do want to also hit on just one point. We had a very significant change in campaign finance regulation sort of mid-election this year as well. So in June of 2024, the General Assembly changed the statute that deals with federal political committee contributions in North Carolina. By change, it's really a rewrite, changing the rules for how that works. I think a primary objective of that statutory change was to undo an executive order that had previously been issued in 2020, I believe, that spoke to contributions from super PACs to North Carolina candidates and committees. So that executive, that advisory opinion had basically stated that a federal super PAC, which under federal law is permitted to take in contributions in excess of limits and from prohibited sources, so from corporations and business entities, labor unions and whatnot. That advisory opinion said, if you are a federal super PAC, you may not give to a North Carolina political party committee. This new statutory language undoes that. So it is now permissible in North Carolina for a super PAC to give to a political party committee. The General Assembly has attempted to include some language in there that specifically states a super PAC that receives corporate funds cannot make that contribution. So the idea being, if you have a federal super PAC that self-selects and chooses not to take advantage of what it is permitted to do under federal law in terms of receiving corporate contributions, if it limits itself to taking individual contributions in excess of contribution limits, it is now permitted to make a contribution to a North Carolina political party committee. Impacts of that, we haven't seen any widespread use of it per se, but until we have audited all reports from the 2024 election, we won't have a good feel for how extensive that's been used. So just one thing to keep on the radar. That's a fairly significant change for us on the campaign finance side of things. So I think that wraps it up for me. I will turn it over to Bob, but I'm certainly happy to chime in on anything from a litigation
You were
standpoint.
backstopping me on the litigation. One thing I learned a long time ago was make sure you hire really smart young people. Lindsay was one of the great hires that I had. So I'm supposed to talk about a litigation update, which there's not much going on, but I'll try to fill the time. So I want to focus on, although Lindsay did send me a long list of litigation that the state board's involved in. And I would note that if you sue over an election matter, you always sue the State Board of Elections in their official capacity. So it's nothing personal that Lindsay and all of our friends at the state board are named as defendants repeatedly in all of this litigation. But there are three that I think merit particular focus on. And I really do need Lindsay's help on this. One deals with the change of who appoints the state board of elections and then subsequently all of the local boards. And historically, at least to my knowledge, it's always been the governor as long as we've had the system. It is now with the legislation this year been moved to the auditor, who said he didn't know anything about it until the General Assembly passed it in the waning moments of 2024. And that has been challenged, but this is where I need some clarification. There was an original lawsuit dealing with the attempted change by the legislature to have in essence the legislature make these appointments. And the governor has attempted to include the challenge to the auditor change in that lawsuit. The defendants have attempted to dismiss that. Am I right on this? I had a hard time.
I think that's correct. I'll be honest, we are actually being removed as a party from that case. So we won't be involved in it any further, but yeah, that case is currently pending, I think, before a 3-judge panel right now in Wayne County Superior Court. And what they are trying to do is basically, transition that case from being about previous legislation with Senate Bill 749, which was a different proposal for change of the State Board of Elections, to really transition this now into, the question for the courts of whether or not there's any constitutional or other, I'm not sure if there are any other claims that are being raised, but any issue with moving this from one executive branch agency to another, right? The previous case was really a question of separation of powers between the General Assembly and the executive branch making appointments to the State Board of Elections. Now it is a case that's really raising the question of authorities within the executive branch and governor versus state auditor.
And so it will either stay in that litigation posture with that 3-judge panel, or they'll dismiss the case, and I assume they'll file a new suit, a separate suit, challenging the constitutionality of changing the appointment powers from the governor to the auditor. But that's probably the single biggest structural issue out there as far as election operation goes. Would that be a fair statement?
In terms of the structure of the agency. For sure.
And that's to take place in June?
I think there's an agreement on a briefing schedule with that. I'm not sure if there's an agreement on the timeline for that actually being heard before the 3-judge panel, but that would be later this spring.
The effectiveness though of is.
Right, so the change to the auditor's office, both for the agency and for the board, the current term, under the legislation, the term of the current board members would end on April 31st. So a new Board of Elections would be appointed on May 1st. The term of the current executive director expires on May 14th. So presumably there'd be the appointment of a new executive director on May 15th. And then the agency itself, which is currently under the North Carolina Secretary of State. So the board is appointed by the governor, but it's under the Secretary of State is where we are today. The agency itself would be moved to the state auditor's office, which is really more so than anything else a move on an organizational chart from being under one executive branch official to another. For the most part, with the exception of some budgetary requirements, the agency would operate independent of the state auditor.
So this litigation is going to go on, and how the system looks this time next year, we don't know. Maybe the auditor running it, ostensibly, yeah, Larry.
So if it stands, does the auditor pick the county boards?
It runs through the state board, but he would be appointing the state board, right?
So there's two parts to it. So at the county board level, the way it works today is the State Board of Elections appoints 4 members, 2 Republican and 2 Democrat, based on sort of way it's structured today, at the county board. And then the chair currently is appointed by the governor. So under this new bill, what would happen is the chair would be appointed by the state auditor. So the state board would continue appointing 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats. The chair would be reflective of the appointing authority's partisan affiliation. So presumably we'd have a Republican chair.
So it would keep the state board appointing the 2 too, but the state board is appointed by the
other. Which it's basically the exact same structure we operate under today. We're just changing the appointment authority, which in this case would also change the partisan composition of the state and county boards.
Chairs, yeah. So, okay, so the second area of litigation, and I've got a dog in this fight, so, and that deals with the gerrymandering issue. And there's several cases out, but I'm gonna talk about the one that I filed, in which we're getting ready to submit our briefs to the Court of Appeals. And I've not convinced Andy Jackson of my constitutional theory, but that doesn't mean that I'm wrong. It just means I haven't convinced Andy yet. But the remedy for my alleged violation is essentially a remedy that Andy has advocated for in his paper in doing away with partisan data. So let me take 3 minutes to say, this is not a political gerrymandering lawsuit. This is an election lawsuit, and it's about election integrity. And so the distinction is the courts in Harper 3 and in Rucho at the U.S. Supreme Court clearly define political gerrymandering as an attack on the map. All of the various districts, whether it's congressional state representative, state senate. It's attack on the maps, and the claims in both those cases was that because North Carolina's essentially a 50-50 state, then there should be some sort of equity in the distribution, some proportionality. There ought to be 7 Democrat seats in the Congress, 7 Republican seats, or somewhere close to that. That was the theory. Both the U.S. Supreme Court and the North Carolina Supreme Court said no claim there. Partisan gerrymandering, as defined in the case, is not unconstitutional. What the Bard case that we filed is an election case on 3 distinct congressional elections in 3 distinct congressional districts, 1 state house district and 1 state senate district. And we all have thought about gerrymandering as map drawing, but this is not a cartography exercise. This is taking the building blocks of the electorate, which is in precincts or in census blocks, and using political data so that you know to a degree certain that this group's going to vote 60-40 Republican, this group's going 45-55. You know, so you use the political data, and then you just put together the building blocks, and that's how you get the district. And so in essence, government, in this case, the General Assembly, but government is deciding through its use of this political data that they are going to dictate in all likelihood who's going to win the elections. So, I mean, I like to say it's no different than Zeno Ponder coming out of this graveyard in Madison County and stuffing 1,000 ballots into the ballot boxes. You fix the outcome. And so the question is there a constitutional right to keep government from doing that? Do you have a right to fair elections that prohibits government from fixing the election results, or at least attempting to fix the election results? We're getting ready to go to the Court of Appeals. We lost at the trial court with them saying, no, this is a political gerrymandering case. We'll see. But, you know, we're going to fight it till the end.
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned, right? All right, so which brings us to the other little
This was filed in state court.
state court, state constitutionalist. There is no state constitutional provision for fair elections. There's a constitutional provision for free elections and frequent elections. And so, but there's also a state constitutional provision for unenumerated rights. It says just because we've set out specific rights, people still retain rights. And so the question is, do we have a right to fair elections? I mean, it's just that simple. Fair elections being that government can't pick and choose who the winners are by manipulating the data in specific election districts. So that's the theory. The ongoing Griffin Riggs litigation reminds me of, and no offense to the court, sort of a Mo Curley and Larry, who's on first? Or that's Bud Abbott and Lou Costello. Wrong group. Bud Abbott and Costello, yeah, who's on first? You know, are we in federal court or are we in state court? And if anybody was so sufficiently bored that they listened to the Fourth Circuit argument over the jurisdictional question, you know that it is a quagmire exactly where this case is supposed to be. And the Fourth Circuit has not ruled yet, but we'll see. I think they're going to rule pretty quickly because on Friday, the Wake County Superior Court will be hearing the appeal of Judge Griffin from the State Board of Elections. This is all after, you know, a trip to the North Carolina Supreme Court on a writ of prohibitus, and finally the court, after staying the certification, sent it back to the Wake County Superior Court. We're a long way from anything being decided on the merits. First, they have to decide, should this be in federal court or should this be in state court? You know, the unique part of judicial elections is that Justice Riggs continues to serve until this is all resolved. So she could serve the 8-year term while this thing's litigated, the way it's going. But it raises three interesting issues on the merits. One dealing with voter registration errors and what's the implication? So in this case, HAVA required driver's license number or if not that, the last 4 of your social security. It's not 100% clear to me exactly if everybody omitted that, or is it just not on the database that the state board has? And then the question is, what do you do with those folks that if their registration has some sort of error? Are they not allowed to vote, even though maybe in this case they had voted in previous elections? Is it curable by showing up at the polls on election day and showing their driver's license? I mean, all of these questions sort of roll out of that particular issue. There's another question involving military overseas ballots, absentee ballots for civilians and military people. It wasn't, they were not required to have a photo ID submitted with their ballots. And then a small pool of people who apparently have never been in North Carolina, but their parents lived here and they've been allowed to register. The one takeaway was Justice Dietz, who's a Republican member of the state Supreme Court, when he was up there, brought up the issue of the Purcell Doctrine, which is a federal doctrine that, you correct me if I'm wrong, Nancy, okay? A federal doctrine that says, you know, if you're into an election, you can't go after you see how the votes come out, you know, start going in and challenging particular statutory or regulatory requirements, in essence, after the fact, and try and get votes thrown out. North Carolina has not formally adopted that, as I understand it. There's at least some controversy over it, but it has significance for litigation, not only in North Carolina, potentially around the country, on the application of that. I mean, can you come in, can you wait and see how the votes come out? And then if you're on the losing end, say, aha, here's a pool of voters who there's something wrong with their registration, or there's, you know, some statutory or regulatory issue. It is, I mean, it's a mess. I mean, if you listen to the Fourth Circuit argument, the presiding judge of the federal panel, when he finished, said, well, if there's anybody here in the courtroom got any answers to this, stand up and let me know, or something to that effect. So, but this has the potential to go on for a long time. And I got no answers, but.
And by the way, this is on page 181 and 182 of your book, this fine legal analysis.
Well, let's just say it's a summary of what I thought was right. Lindsay, anything that I missed?
No, I think you summarized it well. I mean, I think, you know, there is no certificate of election that has gone out in that race. So, you know, this will linger until we have a ruling, so.
Yeah, one quick thing, Julie, the wild card is if this had not been a judicial race, Council of State races, well, one, you might have been back in the legislature, but other races, I don't think there's a holdover provision, is there? I mean, you know, I mean, or if the results had been flipped, let's say Griffin had won by 700 votes and Briggs brought the challenge, then she would be able to continue to hold over, and Griffin would be on the outside looking in until arguably it was. So anyway, just one of the nuances, Julie. Sure.
So, there's a lot of talk about, well, then it puts at jeopardy all the other votes that those people cast. But those races have been certified, so it's irrelevant?
Yes, so this is the only race, I think, at this point, that a certificate of election has not been issued. So those other races, because a similar protest wasn't brought in those races, those are done, certificates of election are out. And those folks, I mean, the General Assembly's been in session for at least a week now.
Yeah.
So
the same voters' votes are valid for those races because it's been certified.
there was no protest in those those races.
Not logical.
One other wild card that we talked about is the 60,000 that are challenged are all early voters, correct?
That's
So
certain.
therefore,
And I think
they are retrievable ballots. So let's say they said, okay, the 60 are, should be struck. You know, you could actually, I think, pull those 60,000 ballots, decide how many voted for Riggs, how many voted for Griffin, do the math, and come up with an answer. But what about the 20% that voted on election day that might fall into the same provision? You know, you can't get their ballots. So now you've got two pools of voters being treated differently, some having their ballot thrown out because they chose to vote early, and it's retrievable, and then a pool that voted on election day and you can't retrieve it. So that's one more, extraneous issue.
And the second part to my question is, so if this drags out for 3 years, what happens to those folks in the midterms? And then no, even this year, can they vote?
Sure, aren't there?
I mean, they could fill out a new voter registration form today, and update that information, with their county board of elections.
Are you guys working on that, or the county boards, or holy cow, they're on the list, they
Yeah,
damn well better cure?
Their lists have been made public. Folks are, and they were notified as part of the protest process. There was a communication that had to go out to those individuals. Some individuals have probably already started to file new voter registration forms based on what was made available to them as part of the protest and based on just public conversation about it. And lists that are continue to be circulated. At this point, I can't speak to whether or not the state board will choose to do anything more systemic than that in terms of, reaching out, and doing any other outreach to these folks.
But
They
how
have
would
not,
folks know who voted on election day, who may have been missing that driver's license number? How would they know they need to go and re-register?
They should know, it's not just early voters, right? Because they would have, where would Griffin get the source of his information? It's the voter turnout.
They have a data company called Goldsmart.
Okay, where would
It's done all-
Colesmart, they would presumably get it from the State Board of Elections turnout, voter history, voter whatever, both of those two files. You get that, you see who has it, so you're getting early voters and election day voters, no?
I think that data is available, but.
The 60,000 are only early voters?
With the
Wait a
driver's
second.
license?
Well, there was an earlier suit by the RNC and the state party challenging 220,000 people.
But that was before the election.
It was
right?
before the election, and so that's sitting in limbo, waiting to see what happens in all of this other.
Yeah, there was an earlier, a lot of this case is based on the Help America Vote Act. There was an earlier Help America Vote complaint. I don't even remember the specific timetable now, that was considered by the state board over the summer. The state board made some determinations based on that complaint, and that has also resulted in a different lawsuit. So there is still pending litigation out there stemming from the board's action on the Help America Vote Act questions, separate and apart from the Griffin protests.
There's a data security question too, because how would they get the information that the social security number or the driver's license number is missing if that's supposed to be not public?
And I can't speak to that data set. It's a little outside of my wheelhouse, but I believe that the fact that that information isn't available, I think is part of the public.
I analyzed this data, we can talk about it later on if you want.
You're gonna talk about later?
No, we can if you
Can
want
you,
later
do you have
on.
a
I
quick
analyzed the
answer?
data.
Yeah, you did,
Yeah.
but do you have a quick answer that answers her question?
How did they know? It's because they asked the State Board of Election for a list of people. And the State Board of Election did what they have to do by law and provided the list.
Oh,
There's
so
a
they didn't
public
give.
records.
So they didn't get it on the public websites, okay.
They asked the State
Okay,
Board for
fair.
people who
Fair.
registered after January 1st, 2002, and who didn't have one of these two pieces of information on file. And the State Board did what they have to do and said, here's a big list. And then Griffin took that list and said, these are the ones I'm challenging. So like I've read some, I think, misinformation where people think Griffin called the list. He didn't call the list. He took the list they gave him and he said, these are the ones I'm challenging, which is why you get like random Republicans on there, right? Because if you call the list, you wouldn't need Republicans on there. It'd be
It's
silly.
not a case if he's not challenging some Republicans.
Well, that'd be unrealistic,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well,
Jessica and then.
oh, I have a question too, so don't miss me.
Okay, all right, Jessica and then Jim and then Martha.
Yeah, thank you. I was just interested in what kind of a chilling effect you think this will have on early voting? Like, do you think that people, in learning more about the retrievable ballot and knowing that this is only challenging early voting people, do you think that's gonna make more people vote during election day?
These are our experts,
I know.
they're our academic
Academics.
experts.
One more question.
Yeah.
Could do an experiment, right? You could do an experiment and tell them, did you know that your vote is retrievable if you vote early? And then ask another half, so randomly assign, your vote is retrievable. Early voting is available to the other half, right? So they don't know, what will that do to your choice of voting?
But that assumes they, like, I love that question. My guess is the average person has no clue.
No clue.
Everybody in this room is gonna vote on election day. Right.
Right, so I bet it does, but I love that.
Jim.
And nobody's been certified in the race, right, as a winner, and Rick's term is expired, right?
No, that's what I was saying. The Constitution provides that they hold over until their successor is elected and certified. So she's there until this is all over and done.
Okay, so this is what I don't understand. I have 2 students that are on that list. Presumably who registered to vote after HAVA, since you know they weren't born when HAVA actually happened. If they don't have a social security or a driver's license number, it's an administrative error. Someone made a mistake.
Well, that's another issue, as I understand it, is, can you penalize the voter if it's an election administration? I mean, if they got, if they got my middle name wrong, on the, could they, could I be kept from voting because the registrations didn't match my driver's license? Lindy?
No, there was, I mentioned that there was a HAVA complaint that was filed earlier this year. As part of considering that HAVA complaint, the State Board of Elections did make changes to the North Carolina voter registration form because the form, the board determined the form wasn't quite compliant with HAVA in the sense that it did not really mandate that data to be entered. So there may be individuals who were presented with an older version of that form. That information was not accurately captured because of how the form was worded. So, what HAVA really requires is if you have a social security number or a driver's license number, it must be listed on the voter registration form. Our form has since been updated. So you can
see a scenario where they were incorrect. If they registered at the DMV, obviously they have.
Correct.
Has this ever been brought up before in North Carolina?
No, but somebody's lawyers are making millions of dollars and I'm just disappointed I'm not one of them.
Moving on that one, to a very quick, you have in your report an analysis of last year's Trusted Elections Tour that was done. It was an expansion of that.
Yeah, I don't have it a minute ago.
It's in there.
I think it's. $160.
160?
160, yes. So public feedback from the town hall activities. You'll see there various input that we got from the public. In that, Jennifer? would you
Yeah,
say
and
anything?
just go quick, I mean, absolutely, it's, we did a quick report, so we don't have to go over it in detail. But it is, page 160. We did a survey, we found out that people do actually increase their confidence when they have an in-person event with Republicans, Democrats singing the same tune. And they're also very impressed and surprised by that kind of collaboration and cooperation. We do have some points. If Catawba wants to continue the trust elections, we have some ideas for improving just the administration of how we did it to get bigger audiences and that kind of thing. We put the media outreach in here. Yeah, that's our whole self-assessment. But what we discovered is that it really did make a difference, for those who were, at an event or watched it online or read about it, in a media article. And so in collaboration with You Can Vote, League of Women Voters, Democracy NC, Common Cause, all these groups that are helping people understand how to vote, why voting matters, that whole civic education. What does your local school board do? Who funds the schools? Is it the city? No. All these things are really important. And we definitely support continuing some kind of town halls. But of course it takes resources and, that's the challenge for everybody. It's a challenge for whether the state does it, whether the nonprofits do it, whether the counties do it. Who's gonna provide the resources to really help people understand why voting matters. And we did see a decrease in turnout versus 2020. Again, some people think the complexity of mail-in ballots. I mean, there were like 3 different envelopes and you had to put a photocopy. I did it for my mother-in-law who's 92. And it was not easy. It's not easy. We sat there and went over it together. So, we need to keep helping people understand how to vote and why voting matters. And that's basically the report's right there. And we're gonna discuss what we do with all this next.
Yes.
Unless anybody has any questions about Bob or Lindsay's or the town trusted election tour, anything like that, before we go into what are we gonna do next and how are you all gonna help? And what's Michael gonna do with Catawba?
That's a great question. But before we get into that, I think just as kind of summing up and kind of hearing what all we have heard from today, I'd ask folks to flip to page 167, 168. The big ideas coming out of the report. And I really want to stress, we haven't said this, I think, but I think it needs to be said. Item number 1. North Carolina has a pretty good system.
Yep.
I'd say it's a damn pretty good system.
Yep.
In terms of running fair, safe, and secure elections. That was our mission. That was our goal. Back in October of 2023, bringing this group together, having heard from North Carolinians through the Trusted Election Tour of 2022, that's what we set out to say. Can we, with confidence, say to our fellow citizens in this state, North Carolina's election system is fair, safe, and secure. Is it a good system? I think we can take away the answer as yes. I think we heard throughout all of the committee reports the desperate and urgent need for public education, knowledge, and awareness. That has to be a potential future initiative for the public to be educated about their election system.
Can I add one
Please.
thing? And participation.
And participation. We hope that by being educated about the process, they will then say, I need to participate because I have confidence, I have an, assuredness that this system will work. So I think they are mutually beneficial and working together in a partnership. But again, bringing that fundamental knowledge is critical, and we hope that will then spur greater participation, particularly among a new generation of voters. I believe as Myron said, and in work that we have done, turnout rates for folks under the age of 44 are considerably lower. They are already not engaged. And we know that if they don't get engaged at a certain time period of their life, makes that much harder to get them to participate. So I think again, that rolls along. Other common themes as I was hearing and listening to all the reports, the issue of staffing, the issue of personnel across the board, the issue of funding, the differences in how counties are interacting and dealing with their election administration. So there's a lot, there's a lot to work with, certainly. And we want to spend this time, the next 20 minutes or so, just kind of really thinking about what should be the partnership moving forward with us here at Catawba College, with the Carter Center, but more importantly, with our fellow citizens about this. We also wanted to talk about where does this report go? We don't want this to be a report that gets shoved on a shelf and never heard from again. We want people to understand this. We are certainly going to publicize it. Who do we need to reach out to? Who do we need to contact? I think that might be a good starting point.
Let me add one more thing. I failed to mention in the transition to Catawba College, and that is, you've heard us talk about the North Carolina Network for Fair, Safe, and Secure Elections. So this is one subset of that network. The network is about 500 people about across the state who we have been in contact with. Either they've served on a town hall, they've been on an election commission, they've been a partner in democracy. People we've talked to in the faith community. We have a faith outreach. The Carter Center actually in the six states has a faith and democracy outreach. In some states, they're very big about having a prayer meeting day of election or day before election to help people think about civility and neighborliness and that kind of thing. So all of that is going to be transitioning to Catawba. Michael's going to talk to the Department of Religion and see if there's a way again to work with the North Carolina Council of Churches and the Quakers and the Muslim community and all the groups that care about democracy, and some from a perspective of faith, because we are a state where that is important. So the network, the faith outreach, the Trusted Elections Tour, and the commission work are all programs the Carter Center helped fund, Bob and I helped lead, but we are now, because they want to make it more local in funding, support, and input, we are now transitioning over the next couple months entirely to this new center for North Carolina politics and public service. And we also would love ideas from you all as to the best way to do that, how to keep those 500 people engaged, how to grow that network even more with limited resources, but helping people feel that they have local ability to make a difference, that their local action and state action, because our election system is a state election system, that we have the ability to have input, to bring more people into this, to provide hope around our basic democratic principles. And so all those programs that we're doing, Michael came to Atlanta last week, and at one point they said, so what have you been thinking? He said, I've been thinking to myself, what have I gotten myself into?
That was the first day. Second day, I was like, okay, yeah, I get this. I get this.
And it's all about depolarizing our country. It's about not being two armed camps that think everybody who voted for somebody else is an idiot, is evil, is wrong, and I want to never see them again. Like, that's not how you build a country. And we believe, in our naivete maybe, that when we get together, we can have civil conversations. We don't have to storm, the government building to try to change things, that we can do it through nonviolence, through democracy, through civil discourse. So those are all the big things to think about, and we need your feedback and input, and we have, 25 minutes to do that?
Yes, and certainly we will take comments into the future. You can find my email address on the college's website. If you need a handy moniker, politics@catawba.edu. That's the easiest way to get in touch with me. But you've certainly heard a lot from us. We want to hear from you, Julie.
I'd actually like to hear from our professors on what they're hearing from their students with regards to people under the age of whatever, that didn't vote, that don't vote, and why they don't vote. I heard some of it as a poll observer, but you all talk to these young voters all the time.
Do you want to give a quick?
The quick. So, I would say that most of my students are political science students. They're always gonna tell me they vote.
They're right.
Or they'll, so that's a tough one, right? I think you probably find research that suggests that political science students are more likely to vote.
Right. I mean, I think this has got to be a key piece of the work going forward.
Yeah, Chris.
Just real quick, I hear some of the same, and I think, yes, the political science effect, but I would just argue the college effect. I think too many of us, I'm very guilty of this, when we say we need to increase the youth vote, we think we need to go to the colleges. I think we need to remember what proportion of young people don't go to four-year colleges. So I think the turnout drop-off is unfortunately not in the folks that are in our classes. I think the turnout drop-off is among other people, and that's where the gulf is.
And I think, I teach a intro to American politics class that oftentimes is non-majors. So these are outside of the data geeks and politics geeks that want to study these things. And honestly, I hear more and more from students saying, I don't see a system where things get done. That the two parties are at such loggerheads that as a generation, these are the children of polarized politics. They know nothing other than the two parties doing this. And when they don't see action being done, they oftentimes will say, I will pursue other means by which to engage in my society other than the traditional political participation dynamic. I think that to me, that's a crisis in generational dynamics that we are trying
It's
to
a
deal
lot
with.
to bite off, but I do think that, going forward, it's hard to ignore that. Do any good work without dealing with that piece of it.
Yeah.
I hate to
Brandon.
put Leslie, but we should ask Leslie too. She works very closely with many different, so I'll just
Let me,
throw that out.
I didn't want to put her immediately on the spot. Let me bounce around Brendan and then Mary Ellen and then Stephen.
Yeah, I mean, just to confirm that point, I mean, Lindsay and I are roughly the same age. We're early first wave millennials, I think. If you are below, I'm 42, I'm gonna be 43 next month, but if you are below 40, if you paid attention in history class, you may remember Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan working together, or Ronald Reagan working with Ted Kennedy on some things. But if you are under 40, you have never observed a functional Congress. And you cannot remember when Republicans and Democrats were friends. And up until the time that I was in high school in the late 1990s, the major taboo when we were young and experimenting with romantic relationships, the number one taboo was to date across racial lines. And that's not true for Generation Z. It's much more problematic to date someone of a different political party than it is race. Imagine that in the South.
Yes, yes. And I'll throw one
Interesting.
grenade into that comment. When you get students now referring to the late 1900s. Welcome to my world. Mary Ellen.
That's a good one for me to follow. But listening to you just now, what popped into my mind is I think we also need to pay very close attention to everyone who is now independent. Because in my friends, I can't name one that hasn't changed from one of the parties to independent. Yeah.
Gen Z hit 50% registered unaffiliated last summer. And that number is only continuing in that regard. Steve?
I was just gonna chime in because I'm also a professor around young students these days, but non-political science students. And I think what I've seen is there's a much bigger sense of fatalism or dread or something. And I'd almost tie that to post-COVID, when students kind of checked out a lot and they feel that everything's, blowing up and they can't do anything about it. But I think it may even predate that, where there was a lot of talk about climate change and they just feel the world's falling apart around them more than they, when I was a student. So I'm a little over 60 now. But when I was a student, we saw things in the world that we didn't like the direction they were going, but we felt we could work to fix that. I don't see as much of that these days. Students are just sort of giving it, not all, but a bigger percentage than.
Any thoughts to share?
Well, I'm gonna complicate the narrative and tell you that student voting has increased. If you look at the data from 10, 15, 20 years ago, our highest turnout was in 2008, but before that, it was even lower. And so it actually this year rebounded. In the beginning, we didn't think it was going to. So there's a problem with youth voting in general, right? When you're young, you're not thinking about it. I will also say one of the challenges, and so North Carolina has a really extensive structure for trying to get students to vote, right? We have a campus voting coalition, which includes 40 campuses in my network. We have a state summit every September. This will be the 10th anniversary of that, where we get all the campuses together to mobilize to vote. I think what Chris said is part of the challenge. When you look at those numbers, it's really people that aren't in college. I would also say our data has shown us, of the students in college that aren't voting, they're in very specific disciplines. We're finding STEM students aren't voting. We're finding international students who are actually coming onto our campuses this is gonna be really interesting, are actually our biggest leaders in our student voting coalitions, because they can't vote and they care about democracy. So they're the ones who are trying to mobilize other students to vote. So there's something interesting happening there. But I would say youth in general tend to not be the folks mobilized. But we're also finding that there are some barriers, right? Our research has shown that there are some real barriers to students being able to vote. Number one, which is why we push to try to get polling places on campuses, and we keep getting resistance to people wanting to take them off campuses. This year, we had more moved away than we had moved onto campuses. They have challenges with transportation. I don't know if you know, statistically, this generation drives less than any generation in history, right? They've Ubered, mom and dad took them everywhere, and so they actually don't have transportation. I know everybody thinks they do, but they don't. There's still the issue of the voter IDs because they don't drive. I know there's this assumption, everybody has a driver's license. They don't. And so even in my network, I could only get 35 of my 40 campuses to even get their IDs approved. I still have 5 that won't, because they don't want to have to change the ID. So there's barriers that exist, but at the end of the day, the biggest issue is people who aren't college educated. Who reaches them? How do we reach them? Where are they? Nobody really knows how to get to that population. Then how do we get the students on campuses who aren't currently engaged to be more engaged? And so I think that's a challenge. And to be clear, even the students that vote are disappointed in the politics. They don't think that their vote really matters, that it's really changing the dynamic. I do worry that is going to continue to make a slide. I think there'll be fewer students wanting to vote because they think their vote isn't as effective, but there's a lot of work being done. And there's a new study that's been around about a decade called NSOLVE, the National Study on Leadership and Voter Education, that actually tracks the data. And our state has more people that are in the top rankings of that in the nation. So our campuses that do this work do it well. Our campuses that don't, right? So when I tell you that the civic education organizations, there are like 20 of them that work at NC State. Big campus, you can't vote, DMNC, Blueprint, me, everybody's there. But there are very few people who are at Piedmont Community College. So there's that issue as well, right? Of where are we directing those resources?
Other thoughts? Should go, Jessica, please.
Well, just agree completely with everything that Leslie said. I mean, I'm 25, like all of the college networks, when I was going through this, that I was very involved in, and I completely agree, like, in the spaces where you expect to have voter networks, they're there, they're doing a phenomenal job, they're helping tear down these barriers. And these are real barriers, these are people who are voting for the first time in their lives, and they cannot get to the polls, they don't know how to find their sample ballot, we assume that everyone kind of knows the information we know. But for these, engineering majors who could care less and just want to show up, it's a very different calculus. And I also completely agree with the point about the sort of generational despair. It's kind of terrible, but I think that's right. I mean, I'm 25, all three of the elections that I've been around for and aware of have been a Trump election. And so it's very much like our generation's political consciousness. And so we don't know the nonpartisanship or the bipartisanship. It's very divisive. And so people think that political activism is protest or it is, some other sort of advocacy work. And they don't think of voting that way because they don't think of voting as a change maker. And so I think it's a very different perspective.
Yeah, I do agree with Leslie and you on the theory that I keep hearing things in various media that people say, I'm not voting, doesn't matter. You said that, and I keep hearing it, so that really made sense to me. So they don't care about this. We can't get them to there until they care and think their vote might make a difference. So that's where I was focusing on, why don't we get them earlier where they're sitting in school and somehow try to reach these kids before they get to the point where, geez, it doesn't matter. It's gonna be the same thing, whether it's Trump or Biden in office. We still come up with but nobody, it doesn't affect that. It doesn't affect me. I'm just here in the hood or wherever.
Or that it really affects me, like politics really affect me, but my vote doesn't change.
So how do we incentivize them?
That was gonna be kind of my question, is as we go forward and look at topics for next year, if we're doing this again or whoever's doing this, we've said a lot, kind of my voice doesn't matter has two contexts. One is when, whoever that person that gets elected, there's loggerheads, so nothing happens in Congress. I got it. There's another one that says that my personal vote, me putting a dot on a paper, doesn't matter because the way the politics work in my state, whatever the case may be. In one of our committees, you guys talked about an alternative of ranked choice voting. That is one of the alternatives. There are many out there to our current system that alternatives at the current electoral college give voice that a lot of people don't have at the state level today. And a couple states in the union practice alternative ways to do that. I think we need to dig into that. While it may not be a popular topic in North Carolina, I think it's a popular topic for people under 40. My son is a 20-year-old poli-sci student at George Mason. They talk about different ways. They're like, in my state, my vote will never matter. And so that is going to stop people from voting 100%.
I was gonna, I may take this a little bit different route. I know we've talked a lot about election reform as part of the commission, but then as we think about public service, we can reform campaign finance. We can maybe wave a magic wand and fix partisan gerrymandering. At the end of the day, right? That might be part of the issue, but we have a civic participation problem. If you do all these things and, only 30% of the most motivated voters show up in primaries, and those are the folks that, elect candidates, you're gonna get, candidates that are perhaps more out of step. So, for me, it's, right, election reform and all of these things are part of the equation, but how do you build the social capital? And as we think beyond this commission, how do we incorporate that into the center? I know, and Andy was here earlier, but I know there's funders out there, the Reynolds Foundation, Hope Foundation, that are working with North Carolina Leadership Forum, which tries to bring these diverse voices together around issues. And I think that's really where people get involved. They care about the issue, right? Whether that's somebody building a granny flat in their backyard or whatever the case may be. And so where we can program around building social capital, talking about issues, and then incorporating voices that are very different than ours. Half the country doesn't have a college education, so how are we incorporating those folks into those conversations, especially at a local level?
Yeah, and I want to build on that. So where we are finding students excited is we do, public problem-solving competitions where we have them come and we say, and one of ours was fair elections and the ideas that they had for how to make them more fair and more trustworthy. You were part of that, Michael. That's where, and Martha, that's where students get energized. So all of that is to say, this idea of like, where are people most enthusiastic about voting in the country? And what is the civic culture there? What is in the water, in the groundwater that makes, so for example, we know that Minnesota, when we did our civic health index of North Carolina, and we're ranked in the bottom on a lot of things around civic culture, they are at the top. And what we find there is that it's a place where they are doing some of those creative engagements, right? Where they have the citizen councils, where they, there's all these like citizen assemblies, like they're doing all these creative ways to get citizen voice at the table in politics, not just young folks, but like the communities come out to these interesting ways that they can give ideas. And some of our jurisdictions are using like public budgeting or civic budgeting. I can't remember the exact name of it. So maybe we could start participatory budgeting. Maybe there's some of these like innovative citizen engagement, social capital things that we could start promoting and looking at that would be creative and get folks to think it's not just voting. It's, it's being
It's a
civically
broad
engaged, right?
I love that idea, and along those lines, a theme that we often refer to in the disability community is nothing about us without us, which means that everybody should have a place at the table. And as we've heard from so many people here, what I keep hearing is us speculating about what's going on in the minds of others that aren't here. And you all have been so intentional about making sure this is a very diverse group politically. I would suggest, recommend that any future action include people who are young, who don't vote, who may be from marginalized communities, and maybe even have to pay them for their service because they don't have the time to devote a day to, come to Talbot County. So that would be along those lines.
Yeah, I just wanted to also offer and where'd Nathan go? Oh, there he is. The Carter Center has also offered to continue to be an advisor in this, and they have done things like de-escalation training, difficult conversations. And there's actually another group called Living Room Conversations, where it's all about how do you have that difficult conversation at Thanksgiving with your extreme, whichever left or right, relative. They have interfaith. There are some interfaith networks that are working on talking across difference, understanding our commonality. Raver Angels is a group that we have partnered with a little bit. They have a very specific blue and red configuration, which some people find a little bit off-putting, but some people find really helpful because it's so structured. Bystander intervention. They're even like if you see someone being bullied or being discriminated against or being shouted out in the supermarket or where, how do you gently, without, harming yourself, how do you intervene? Like there are peace teams that have practices that can share that. And, all of these are techniques and trainings. And I don't know, again, if we bring that to young people, if we bring that to rural areas, how you do that in partnership. But just wanted to mention that the Carter Center has said that they've got, and Michael has to take a phone call. Where is Judy Woodruff? You're gonna pick her up. That is something that, there are resources if people think that those kinds of trainings would be helpful. And, there are different viewpoints on whether you do it in person, do you do it by Zoom? Is it impersonal if you do it by Zoom? I mean, there's all, the hybrid stuff. That can all be worked through, but we would love to hear if you think, and we don't have to figure it all out in the next 10 minutes. You have all our emails. We also want each one of you, and we're gonna send it out to the whole commission group, we're gonna send it out to our whole network. Which of you are able or, interested in continuing in any of these aspects I know many of you are working elections, you're gonna keep doing that and educating in your own, way, and that's awesome. And many of you are with our, partnering organizations, but think about what resources would be helpful. Do we reach, some of the folks that we haven't reached in all the work that we've been doing? Cause, this is nothing is gonna change, nothing's gonna go away, unless we're part of bringing that change. So I just wanted to mention the resources that the Carter Center and others have that we could take advantage of. Are you okay? Do you have to go get Judy, or are you okay?
Judy is here. She's at the guest house, so
Okay.
I will go over in a few minutes and pick her up. Again, let me express, I hope on behalf of the steering committee and everyone associated with it, the thanks for your time today. This was a long day and great conversations and important work that was done. And we are truly thankful for everything that you have invested your time and energy into this endeavor. We hope that it's not the end of this conversation. I will be very candid. I'm gonna need help. I'm gonna need some kind of direction. I'm gonna need input. I'm gonna need advice.
All yours.
I'm gonna need the criticism as well about moving this project forward and what we need to do. Because I think as we will hear from Judy and where she is shifting her attention from polarization to depolarization, it needs to occur at the local level. It needs to occur one-on-one, and then we build up from there. On this morning's Charlotte Talk, we got pushback on that. How are we gonna deal with the national dynamics at the local level? Everything in American history teaches us that oftentimes things that are fundamentally shifting and dynamics of change begin the occurrence at the local level. So I would like to ask, I'm not gonna be sending out mass emails every other day, but getting information out to this network, to this group of individuals, and then having you distribute that information. I can't buy that kind of media exposure, to be quite candid. It is the power of you conveying to your friends, to your acquaintances, to your networks, what is going on and what is vitally needed in our communities. And so I hope, as a concluding thought, I friendly ask if you would consider continuing in a role of receiving information, sharing perspective. It would be a lot. It would mean a lot to me to help guide you in this new endeavor that we're taking. So with that.